Section 23 of Myths of Northern Lands. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Myths of Northern Lands by H.A. Guerber. Chapter 23, The Giants. As we've already seen, the northern races imagined that the giants were the first creatures who came to life among the icebergs filling the vast abyss of Gununga Gap. These giants were from the very beginning the opponents and rivals of the gods, and as the latter were the personifications of all that is good and lovely, the former naturally served to denote all that was ugly and evil. Slain by the gods, Ymir, the first giant, fell lifeless on the ice, drowning all his progeny in his blood. One couple only, Bergelmir and his wife, effected their escape to the confines of the world, Jotunheim, where they took up their abode and became the parents of all the giant race. In the north, the giants were called by various names, each having a particular meaning. Jotun, for instance, meant the great eater, for the giants were noted for their enormous appetites, as well as for their uncommon size. As they were fond of drinking as well as of eating, they were also called thyrsus, a word which some writers claim had the same meaning as thirst, while others think they owed this name to the high towers, terces, which they were supposed to have built. As the giants were antagonistic to the gods, the latter always strove to keep them at a distance, and drove them away into Jotunheim, in the cold regions of the pole, where they condemned them to remain. The giants were almost invariably worsted in their encounters with the gods, for they were heavy and slow-witted, and had nothing but stone weapons to oppose the Aesir's bronze. In spite of this inequality, however, they were sometimes greatly envied by the gods, for they were thoroughly conversant with all knowledge relating to the past. Odin himself was envious of this acquirement, and no sooner had he secured it by a draught from Mimir's spring than he hastened off to Jotunheim to measure himself against Vafthrudr, the most learned of the giant band. But he would never have succeeded in defeating his antagonist in this strange encounter, had he not ceased inquiring about the past, and propounded a question relating to the future. Of all the gods, Thor was the most feared by the Jotuns, for he was continually waging war against the frost and mountain giants, who would fain have hindered agriculture and bound the earth forever in their rigid bands. In fighting against them, Thor, as we have already seen, generally had recourse to his crushing hammer Mjolnir, with which he reduced them to powder. The Germans fancied that the uneven surface of the earth was due to the giants, who, treading upon it while it was still soft and newly created, marred its smoothness, while the giantesses, seeing the valleys made by their huge footprints, shed copious tears, which formed the streams. As such was the Teutonic belief, the people imagined that the giants, who were their personifications of the mountains, were huge, uncouth creatures, who could only move about in the darkness or fog, and who were petrified as soon as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the gloom or scattered the clouds. This belief made them call one of their principal mountain chains the Risengebirge, giant mountains. The Scandinavians also shared this belief, and to this day the Icelanders designate their highest mountain peaks by the name of Jökull, a modification of the word Jotun. In Switzerland, where the everlasting snows rest upon the lofty mountain tops, the people still relate old stories of the time when the giants roamed abroad, and when an avalanche comes crashing down the mountainside, they say the giants have restlessly shaken off part of the icy burden from their brows and shoulders. As the giants were also personifications of snow, ice, cold, stone, and subterranean fire, they were all said to be descended from the primitive Fornjotnir, whom some authorities identify with Ymir. According to this version of the myth, Fornjotnir had three sons, Hlur, the sea, Keri, the air, and Loki, fire. These three divinities were the first gods, formed the oldest trinity, and their respective descendants were the sea giants, Mimir, Gymir, and Grendel, the storm giants, Thiassi, Therm, and Beli, and the giants of fire and death, such as the Fenris wolf and Hel. As all the royal dynasties claimed descent from some mythical being, the Merovingians asserted that their first progenitor was a sea giant, who rose up out of the waves in the form of an ox, surprised the queen while she was walking alone on the seashore, and induced her to become his wife. She gave birth to a son named Merovius, the founder of the first dynasty of Frankish kings. Many stories have already been told about the most important giants. They reappear in many of the later myths and fairy tales, and manifest after the introduction of Christianity, a peculiar dislike to the sound of church bells and the singing of the monks and nuns. The Scandinavians relate in this connection that in the days of Olaf the Saint, a giant named Sengemond, who dwelt on the island of Sengen, was greatly incensed because a nun on the island of Grypto daily sang her morning hymn. The sound of this singing troubled his daydreams, for he had fallen in love with a beautiful maiden named Uternagesta, and was trying to gain courage to propose to her. When he made his halting request, however, the fair damsel scornfully rejected him, declaring that he was far too old and ugly to suit her taste. "Miserable Sengemond, ugly and grey, thou win the maid of Kvelford. No, a churl thou art, and shalt ever remain." Ballad, Brace's translation. In his anger at being thus scornfully refused, the giant swore vengeance, and soon after he shot a great stone arrow from his bow at the maiden, who dwelt 80 miles away. Her lover, Torge, also a giant, seeing her peril and wishing to protect her, flung his hat at the speeding arrow. This hat was 1,000 feet high and proportionally broad and thick, but a collision with it only spent the force of the arrow, which, piercing the giant's headgear, fell short of its aim. Sengemond, seeing he had failed, and fearing the wrath of Torge, mounted his steed and prepared to ride away as quickly as possible. But the sun, rising above the horizon just then, turned him into stone, as well as the arrow and Torge's hat, which is now known as the Torghatten Mountain. The people still point out the stone arrow, a huge obelisk, the hole in the mountain, which is 289 feet high and 88 feet wide, and the horseman on Sengen Island, apparently riding a colossal steed and drawing the folds of his wide cavalry cloak closely about him. As for the nun whose singing had so disturbed Sengemond that he could not propose properly, she was petrified too, and never troubled anyone with her sodomy again. Another legend relates that one of the mountain giants, annoyed by the ringing of church bells more than 50 miles away, once caught up a huge rock, which he hurled at the sacred building, but which fortunately fell short and broke in two. Ever since then, on Christmas Eve, the peasants report that the trolls have come to raise the largest piece of stone upon golden pillars, and to dance and feast beneath it. A lady, wishing to know whether this tale were true, once sent her groom to the place. The trolls came forward and hospitably offered him a drink and a horn mounted in gold and ornamented with runes. Seizing the horn, the groom flung its contents away and dashed off at a mad gallop, closely pursued by all the trolls, from whom he escaped only by passing through a stubble field and over running water. A deputation of trolls visited the lady on the morrow to claim this horn, and when she refused to part with it, they laid a curse upon her, declaring that her castle would burn down every time the horn was removed. This prediction has thrice been fulfilled, and now the family guard their horn with superstitious care. A similar drinking vessel, obtained in much the same fashion by the Oldenburg family, is exhibited in the collection of the King of Denmark. The giants were not supposed to remain stationary, but were said to move about in the darkness, sometimes transporting masses of earth and sand, which they dropped here and there, thus forming the sand hills in northern Germany and Denmark. A North Frisian tradition relates that the giants also possessed a colossal ship, called Manningfuel, which constantly cruised about in the Atlantic Ocean. Such was the size of this vessel that the captain was said to pace the deck on horseback. The rigging was so extensive and the masts so high that the sailors who went up as youths came down as gray-haired men, having rested and refreshed themselves in rooms fashioned and provisioned for that purpose in the huge blocks and pulleys. By some mischance it happened that the pilot once directed this immense vessel into the North Sea, and wishing to return to the Atlantic as soon as possible, yet not daring to turn around in such a small space, he steered into the English Channel. Imagine the dismay of all on board when they saw the passage grow narrower and narrower the farther they advanced. When they came to the narrowest spot between Calais and Dover, it seemed barely possible that the vessel, drifting along with the current, could force its way through. The captain, with laudable presence of mind, promptly bade his men soap the sides of the vessel, laying an extra thick layer on the starboard, where the rugged Dover cliffs threateningly rose. These orders were no sooner carried out than the vessel entered the narrow space, and thanks to the captain's precaution, it slipped safely through. The rocks of Dover scraped off so much soap, however, that ever since then they've been very white indeed, and the waves dashing against them still have a particularly foamy appearance. This exciting experience was not the only one which the Manging Fool passed through, for we are told that once, nobody knows how, penetrated into the Baltic Sea, where the water not being deep enough to keep the vessel afloat, the captain ordered all the ballast thrown overboard. Such was the amount of material thus cast on either side the vessel into the sea, that it formed the two islands of Bornholm and Christiansø. In Thuringia and in the Black Forest the stories of the giants are very numerous indeed, and the peasants delight in telling about Ilse, the lovely daughter of the giant of the Ilsenstein. She was so charming that she was known far and wide as the beautiful Princess Ilse, and was wooed by many knights, among whom she preferred the Lord of Westerburg. But her father did not at all approve of her consorting with a mere mortal, and forbade her seeing her lover. Princess Ilse was wilful, and in spite of his prohibitions, she daily visited her lover. The giant, exasperated by her persistency and disobedience, finally stretched out his huge hands, and seizing the rocks, tore a great gap between the height where he dwelt and the castle of Westerburg. Princess Ilse, perceiving the cleft which parted her from her lover, recklessly flung herself over the precipice into the raging flood beneath, where she was changed into a bewitching Undine. She dwelt here in the limpid waters for many a year, appearing from time to exercise her fascinations upon mortals, and even, it is said, captivating the affections of the Emperor Henry, who paid frequent visits to her cascade. Her last appearance, according to popular belief, was at Pentecost, 100 years ago, and the natives have not yet ceased to look for the beautiful princess, who is said still to haunt the stream and wave her white arms to entice travelers into the cool spray of the waterfall. I am the Princess Elsa, and I dwell at the Elsenstein. Come with me to my castle, and bliss shall be mine and thine. With the cool of my glass-clear waters, thy brow and thy locks I'll lave, and thou'lt think of thy sorrows no longer, for all that thou look'st so grave. With my white arms twined about thee, and lapped on my breast so white, thou shalt lie and dream of Elfland, its loves and wild delight. Hine, Martin's translation. The giants inhabited all the earth before it was given to mankind. They very reluctantly made way for the human race, and were retreated into the waste and barren parts of the country, where they brought up their families in strict seclusion. Such was the ignorance of their offspring, that a young giantess, straying away from home, once came to an inhabited valley, where for the first time in her life she saw a farmer ploughing on the hillside. Deeming him a pretty plaything, she caught him up with his team, thrust them into her apron, and gleefully carried them home to exhibit them to her father. But the giant immediately bade her carry peasant and horses back to the place where she had found them, and when she had done so, she sadly explained that the creatures whom she took for mere playthings would eventually drive all the giant folk away and become masters of all the earth. End of section 23.
Section 24 of Myths of Northern Lands. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Larry Wilson. Myths of Northern Lands by H.A. Guerber. The Dwarfs. In the first chapter we saw how the Black Elves, Dwarfs, or Svartalfar, were bred like maggots in the flesh of the slain giant Ymir. The gods, perceiving these tiny, unformed creatures creeping in and out, gave them form and features, calling them dark elves on account of their swarthy complexions. These small beings were so homely, with their dark skin, green eyes, large heads, short legs, and crow's feet, that they were told to hide underground, and never show themselves during the daytime, under penalty of being turned into stone. Although less powerful than the gods, they were far more intelligent than men, and as their knowledge was boundless and extended even to the future, gods and men were equally anxious to question them. They were also known as trolls, kobolds, brownies, goblins, pucks, or holder folk, according to the country where they dwelt. "You are the grey troll with the great green eyes, but I love you, grey troll, you are so wise. Tell me this sweet morn, tell me all you know, tell me, was I born? Tell me, did I grow?" The Legend of the Little Fay, Buchanan. The Tarnkappe. These dwarfs could transport themselves with marvelous celerity from one place to another, loved to conceal themselves behind rocks, and mischievously repeated the last words of every conversation they overheard. Owing to this well-known trick, the echoes were called dwarfs' talk, and people fancied that the reason why they were never seen was because each dwarf was the proud possessor of a tiny red cap which made the wearer invisible. This cap was called Tarnkappe, and it was owing to it only that the dwarfs dared appear above the surface of the earth after sunrise without fear of being petrified. "Away, let not the sun view me, I dare no longer stay. An elfin child thou wouldst me see, to stone turn at his ray." The Motte Fuge. The magic of the dwarfs. The dwarfs, as well as the elves, were ruled by a king, who in various countries of northern Europe was known as Andarve, Albrecht, Elbergast, Gondomar, Lorraine, and Oberon. He dwelt in a magnificent subterranean palace, all studded with the gems which his subjects had drawn from the bosom of the earth, and besides untold riches and the Tarnkappe, he owned a magic ring, an invisible sword, and a belt of strength. At his command his subjects, who were very clever smiths, fashioned marvelous jewels or weapons, which he bestowed upon favorite mortals. We have already seen how the dwarfs fashioned Sif's golden hair, the ship Skidbladnir, the point of Odin's spear Gungnir, the ring Draupnir, the golden bristled boar Golenbrüsti, the hammer Mjolnir, the Freya's golden necklace Brisingamen. They are also said to have made a magic girdle which Spenser describes in his poem The Fairy Queen, a girdle which was said to have the power of revealing whether the wearer were virtuous or a hypocrite. That girdle gave the virtue of chaste love, and wifehood true to all that did it bear. But whosoever contrary doth prove, might not the same about her middle wear, but it would loose or else asunder tear. Fairy Queen, Spenser. The dwarfs also manufactured the mythical sword Tyrfing, which would cut through iron and stone, and which they gave to Angantyr. This sword, like Frey's, fought on its own accord, and could not be sheathed after it was once drawn, until it had tasted blood. Angantyr was so proud of this weapon that he had it buried with him. But his daughter Hervor visited his tomb at midnight, recited magic spells, and forced him to rise from his grave to give her the precious blade. She wielded it bravely, and it eventually became the property of another of the northern heroes. The dwarfs were generally kindly and helpful. Sometimes they kneaded bread, ground flour, brewed beer, performed countless household tasks, and harvested and threshed the grain for the farmers. If ill-treated, however, or turned into ridicule, these little creatures forsook the house and never came back again. When the old gods ceased to be worshipped in the Northlands, the dwarfs entirely withdrew from the country, and a ferryman once said that he had been hired to ply his boat back and forth across the river one night, and that at every trip his vessel was so laden down with invisible passengers that it nearly sank. When his night's work was over, he received a rich reward, and his employer informed him that he had helped all the dwarfs across the river, for they were leaving the country forever to punish the people for their unbelief. changelings. According to popular superstition, the dwarfs envied man's taller stature, and often tried to improve their race by winning human wives or by stealing unbaptized children, and substituting their own offspring for the human mother to nurse. These dwarf babies were known as changelings, and were recognizable by their puny and wizened forms. To recover possession of her own babe, and to rid herself of the changeling, a woman was obliged either to brew beer in egg-shells, or to grease the soles of the child's feet and hold them so near the flames that, attracted by their offspring's distressed cries, the dwarf parents would hasten to claim their own and return the stolen child. The female trolls were also said to have the power of changing themselves into maras, or nightmares, and of tormenting any one they pleased. But if the victim succeeded in stopping up the hole through which a mara made her ingress into his room, she was entirely at his mercy, and he could even force her to marry him if he chose to do so. A wife thus obtained was sure to remain as long as the opening through which she had entered the house was closed. But if the plug were removed, either by accident or design, she immediately effected her escape and never returned. A conjecture. Some writers have ventured a conjecture that the dwarfs so often mentioned in the ancient sagas and fairy tales were real beings, probably Phoenician miners, who, working the coal, iron, copper, gold, and tin mines of England, Norway, Sweden, etc., took advantage of the simplicity and credulity of the early inhabitants to make them believe that they belonged to a supernatural race and always dwelt underground, in a region which was called Svartalfaheim, or the home of the Black Elves. End of section 24. Section 25 of Myths of Northern Lands. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Larry Wilson. Myths of Northern Lands by H.A. Guerber. The Elves. Besides the dwarfs, there was another numerous class of tiny creatures called Leos Alfar, light or white elves, who inhabited the realms of air between heaven and earth, had their palace in Alfheim, and were gently governed by the genial god Frey. They were lovely, beneficent beings, so pure and innocent that, according to some authorities, their name was derived from the same root as the Latin word white, albus, which in a modified form was given to the Alps, those snow-covered mountains, and to Albion, England, because of her white chalk cliffs, which could be seen from afar. The elves were so small that they could flit about unseen to care for the flowers, birds, and butterflies, and as they were passionately fond of dancing, they often slipped down to earth on a moonbeam to dance on the green. Holding one another by the hand, they danced round in circles, thereby making the fairy rings, which could easily be discovered as the grass grew greener and more luxuriant in the places their little feet had trod. Merry elves their moors pacing, to aerial minstrelsy, emerald rings on brown heaths tracing, trip it deft and merrily. Walter Scott. If any mortal stood in the middle of one of these fairy rings, he could, according to popular belief in England, see the fairies and enjoy their favor. But the Germans and Scandinavians vowed that the unhappy man must die. In connection with this superstition, they tell how Sir Olaf, riding off to his wedding, was enticed by the fairies into their ring. On the morrow, instead of a merry marriage, his friends witnessed a triple funeral, for his mother and bride both died of grief when they beheld his lifeless corpse. Master Olaf rode forth ere dawn of the day, and came where the elf folk were dancing away. The dance is so merry in the green wood. And on the next morn, ere the daylight was red, in Master Olaf's house lay 3 corpses dead. The dance is so merry in the greenwood. First Master Olaf, and next his young bride, and third his old mother, for sorrow she died. The dance is so merry in the greenwood. Master Olaf at the Elfin Dance, Howitt's translation. Fairies or Fays. These elves, who in England were called fairies or fays, were also enthusiastic musicians, and delighted especially in a certain tune which was known as the Elf dance, and which was so irresistible that no one could hear it without dancing. If a mortal, overhearing the air, ventured to play it, he suddenly found himself incapable of stopping, and was forced to play on and on until he died of exhaustion, unless he were deft enough to play the tune backwards, or someone charitably slipped behind him and cut the strings of his violin. His hearers, who were forced to dance as long as the tones continued, could only pause when they ceased. The Will-o'-the-Wisps. In the North, in the medieval ages, the will-o'-the-wisps were known as lights, for these tiny sprites were supposed to mislead travelers, and popular superstition claimed that the jack-o'-lanterns were the restless spirits of murderers forced against their will to return to the scene of their crimes. As they nightly walked thither, it is said that they doggedly repeated with every step, "It is right," but as they returned they sadly reiterated, "It is wrong." Oberon and Titania. In later times the fairies or elves were said to be ruled by the king of the Dwarfs, who, being an underground spirit, was considered a demon, and allowed to retain the magic power which the missionaries had wrested from the god Frey. In England and France the king of the fairies was known by the name Oberon. He governed fairyland with his queen Titania, and held his highest revels on earth on Midsummer Night. It was then that the fairies all congregated around him, and danced most merrily. "Every elf and fairy sprite hop as light as bird from briar, and this ditty after me sing and dance it trippingly." Midsummer Night's Dream, Shakespeare. These elves, like the brownies, Holder folk, kobold, etc., were also supposed to visit human dwellings, and it was said that they took mischievous pleasure in tangling and knotting horses' manes and tails. These tangles were known as elf-locks, and whenever a farmer described them, he declared that his steeds had been elf-ridden during the night. Aufblatt. In Germany and Scandinavia, sacrifices were offered to the elves to make them propitious. These sacrifices, which consisted either of some small animal or of a bowl of honey and milk, were known as Aufblatt, and were quite common until the missionaries taught the people that the elves were mere demons. The sacrifice once offered to them was then transferred to the angels, who were long entreated to befriend mortals, and propitiated it by the same gifts. Many of the elves were supposed to live and die with the trees or plants which they tended. But these moss, wood, or tree maidens, while remarkably beautiful when seen in front, were hollow like a trough when viewed from behind. They appeared in many of the popular tales, but almost always as benevolent and helpful spirits, for they were anxious to do good to mortals, and to remain on a friendly footing with them. Images on doorposts. In Scandinavia, the elves, both light and dark, were worshipped as household divinities, and their images were carved on the doorposts. The Norsemen, who were driven away from home by the tyranny of Harald Haarfagr in 874, entered their ships, taking these carved doorposts with them. Similar carvings, including images of the gods and heroes, decorated the pillars of their high seats, which they also carried away. The exiles showed their trust in their gods by throwing these wooden images overboard when they neared the Icelandic shores, and settling where the waves carried the posts, although the spot scarcely seemed the most desirable. Thus they carried with them the religion, the poetry, and the laws of their race, and on this desolate volcanic island they kept these records unchanged for hundreds of years, while other Teutonic nations gradually became affected by their intercourse with Roman and Byzantine Christianity. These records, carefully collected by Seaman the Learned, form the Elder Edda, the most precious relic of ancient northern literature, without which we would know comparatively little of the religion of our forefathers. The sagas relate that the first Norse settlements in Greenland and Vineland were made in the same way, the Norsemen piously landing wherever their household gods drifted ashore, many years before the voyage of Columbus and the accredited discovery of America. End of section 25.
Section 26 of Myths of Northern Lands. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sonia. Myths of Northern Lands by H.A. Guerber. The Sigurd Saga, Part 1. While the first part of the Elder Edda consists of a collection of alliterative poems describing the creation of the world, the adventures of the gods, their eventual downfall, and gives a complete exposition of the northern code of ethics, the second part comprises a series of heroic lays describing the life and adventures of the Volsung family, and especially of their chief representative, Sigurd, the great northern warrior. The Volsunga Saga. These lays form the basis of the great Scandinavian epic, the Volsunga Saga, and have supplied not only the materials for the Nibelungenlied, the German epic, and for countless folk tales, but also for Wagner's celebrated operas, the Rheingold, Valkyr, Siegfried, and The Dusk of the Gods. They have also been rewritten by William Morris, the English poet, who has given them the form which they will probably retain in our literature, and it is from this work that almost all the quotations in this chapter are taken in preference to extracts from the Edda. Sigi. Sigi, Odin's son, was a powerful man, and generally respected until he killed a man out of jealousy because the latter had slain the most game when they were out hunting together. In consequence of this crime, Sigi was driven from his own land and declared an outlaw. But although he was a criminal, he had not entirely forfeited Odin's favor, for the god now gave him a well-equipped vessel, provided him with a number of brave followers, and promised that victory should ever attend him. Thanks to Odin's protection, Sigi soon won the glorious empire of the Huns, and became a powerful monarch. But when he had attained extreme old age, his fortune changed. Odin suddenly forsook him, his wife's kindred fell upon him, and after a short encounter he was treacherously slain. Rerir. His death was soon avenged, however, for his son Rerir, returning from a journey, put all the murderers to death and claimed the throne. But in spite of all outward prosperity, Rerir's dearest wish, a son to succeed him, remained unfulfilled for many a year. Finally, however, Frigga decided to grant his constant prayer, and to vouchsafe the heir he longed for. Her swift messenger, Gna, or Liot, was dispatched to carry him a miraculous apple, which she dropped into his lap as he was sitting alone on the hillside. Glancing upward, Rerir recognized the emissary of the goddess, and joyfully hastened home to partake of the apple with his wife. The child thus born in answer to their prayers was a handsome little lad called Volsung, who, losing both parents in early infancy, became ruler of all the land. Volsung. Every year Volsung's wealth and power increased, and as he was the boldest leader, many brave warriors rallied round him, and drank his mead sitting beneath the branstock, a mighty oak, which, rising in the middle of his dwelling, pierced the roof and overshadowed the whole house. And as in all other matters, 'twas all earthly houses' crown, and the least of its wall-hung shields was a battle world's renown. So therein withal was a marvel and a glorious thing to see, for amidst of its midmost hall-floor sprang up a mighty tree, that reared its blessings roofward and wreathed the roof-tree dear with the glory of the summer and the garland of the year. Volsung did not long remain childless, for 10 stalwart sons and 1 lovely daughter, Signy, came to brighten his home. As soon as this maiden reached marriageable years, many suitors asked for her hand, which was finally pledged to Siggeir, king of the Goths, whom, however, she had never seen. The wedding of Signy. The wedding day came, and when the bride first beheld her destined groom, she shrank back in dismay, for his puny form and lowering glances contrasted oddly with her brother's strong frames and frank faces. But it was too late to withdraw. The family honor was at stake. and Signy so successfully concealed her dislike that none except her twin brother Sigmund suspected how reluctantly she became Sigurd's wife. The sword in the brandstock. The wedding feast was held as usual, and when the merry-makings had reached their height, the guests were startled by the sudden entrance of a tall, one-eyed man, closely enveloped in a mantle of cloudy blue. Without vouchsafing word or glance to any in the assembly, the stranger strode up to the brandstock, and thrust a glittering sword up to the hilt in its great bowl. Then turning slowly around, he faced the awe-struck assembly, and in the midst of the general silence declared that the weapon would belong to the warrior who could pull it out, and that it would assure him victory in every battle. These words ended, he passed out and disappeared, leaving an intimate conviction in the minds of all the guests that Odin, king of the gods, had been in their midst. So sweet his speaking sounded, so wise his words did seem, that moveless all men sat there, as in a happy dream we stir not lest we waken. But there his speech had end, and slowly down the hall floor and outward did he wend, and none would cast him a question or follow on his ways, for they knew that the gift was Odin's, a sword for the world to praise. Volsung was the first to recover the power of speech, and waiving his own right to try to secure the divine weapon, he invited Sigurd to make the first attempt to draw it out of the tree trunk. The bridegroom anxiously tugged and strained, but the sword remained firmly embedded in the oak. He resumed his seat with an air of chagrin, and then Volsung also tried and failed. But the weapon was evidently not intended for either of them, and the young Volsung princes were next invited to try their strength. "Sons I have gotten and cherished, now stand ye forth and try, lest Odin tell in Godhome how from the way he strayed, and how to the man he would not he gave away his blade." Sigmund. The 9 eldest sons were equally unsuccessful, but when Sigmund, the 10th and youngest, laid his firm young hand upon the hilt, it easily yielded to his touch, and he triumphantly drew the sword out without making the least exertion. At last by the side of the brandstock Sigmund the Volsung stood, and with right hand wise in battle the precious sword hilt caught, yet in a careless fashion, as he deemed it all for naught. When lo, from floor to rafter went up a shattering shout, for aloft in the hand of Sigmund the naked blade showed out. As high o'er his head he shook it, for the sword had come away from the grip of the heart of the brandstock, as though all loose it lay. All present seemed overjoyed at his success, but Sigurd's heart was filled with envy, for he coveted the possession of the weapon, which he now tried to purchase from his young brother-in-law. Sigmund, however, refused to part with it at any price, declaring that the weapon had evidently been intended for him only. This refusal so offended Sigurd that he secretly resolved to bide his time, to exterminate the proud race of the Volsungs, and thus secure the divine sword. Concealing his chagrin, therefore, he turned to Volsung, and cordially invited him to visit his court a month later, bringing all his sons and kinsmen with him. The invitation, so spontaneously given, was immediately accepted, and although Signy, suspecting evil, secretly sought her father while her husband slept, and implored him to retract his promise and stay at home, he would not consent to appear afraid. Sigurd's treachery. A few weeks after the return of the bridal couple, Volsung's well-meant vessels came within sight of Sigurd's shores, and Signy, perceiving them, hastened down to the beach to implore her kinsmen not to land, warning them that her husband had treacherously planned an ambush whence they could never escape alive. But Volsung and his sons, whom no peril could daunt, calmly bade her return to her husband's palace, and donning their arms, they boldly set foot ashore. Then sweetly Volsung kissed her. "Woe am I for thy sake, but earth the word hath hearkened, that yet unborn I spake. How I ne'er would turn me backward from the sword or fire of bale. I have held that word till to-day, and to-day shall I change the tale? And look on these thy brethren, how goodly and great are they. Wouldst thou have the maidens mock them, when this pain hath passed away, and they sit at the feast hereafter, that they feared the deadly stroke? Let us do our day's work deftly, for the praise and the glory of folk. And if the Norns will have it that the Volsung kin shall fail, yet I know of the deed that dies not, and the name that shall ever avail. Marching towards the palace, the brave little troop soon fell into Sigurd's ambuscade, and although they fought with heroic courage, they were so overpowered by the superior number of their foes that Volsung was soon slain, and all his sons made captive. Led bound into the presence of Sigurd, who had taken no part in the fight, for he was an arrant coward, Sigmund was forced to relinquish his precious sword, and he and his brothers were all condemned to die. Signy, hearing this cruel sentence, vainly interceded for them, but all she could obtain by her prayers and entreaties was that her kinsmen should be chained to a fallen oak in the forest, there to perish of hunger and thirst if the wild beasts spared them. Then, fearing lest his wife should visit and succor her brothers, Sigurd confined her in the palace, where she was closely guarded night and day. Early every morning Sigurd himself sent a messenger into the forest to see whether the Volsungs were still living, and every morning the man returned, saying a monster had come during the night and had devoured one of the princes, leaving nothing but his bones. When none but Sigmund remained alive, Signy finally prevailed upon one of her servants to carry some honey into the forest and smear it over her brother's face and mouth. That very night the wild beast, attracted by the smell of the honey, licked Sigmund's face, and even thrust its tongue into his mouth. Clinching his teeth upon it, Sigmund, weak and wounded as he was, struggled until his bonds broke, and he could slay the nightly visitor who had caused the death of all his brothers. Then he vanished into the forest, where he remained concealed until the daily messenger had come and gone, and until Signy, released from captivity, came speeding to the forest to weep over her kinsman's remains. Seeing her evident grief, and knowing she had no part in Sigurd's cruelty, Sigmund stole out of his place of concealment, comforted her as best he could, helped her to bury the whitening bones, and registered a solemn oath in her presence to avenge his family's wrongs. This vow was fully approved by Signy, who, however, bade her brother abide a favorable time, promising to send him a helper. Then the brother and sister sadly parted, she to return to her distasteful palace home, and he to seek the most remote part of the forest, where he built a tiny hut and plied the trade of a smith. And men say that Signy wept when she left that last of her kindred, yet wept she never more amid the earls of Sigurd. And as lovely as before was her face to all men's deeming, nor aught it changed for ruth, nor for fear nor any longing, and no man said forsooth that she ever laughed thereafter till the day of her death was come. Signy's sons. Years passed by. Sigurd, having taken possession of the Volsung kingdom, proudly watched the growth of his eldest son, whom Signy secretly sent to her brother as soon as he was 10 years of age, bidding Sigmund train the child up to help him, if he were worthy of such a task. Sigmund reluctantly accepted the charge, but as soon as he had tested the boy and found him deficient in physical courage, he either sent him back to his mother, or, as some versions relate, slew him. Some time after this, Sigmund tested Signy's second son, who had been sent to him for the same purpose, and found him wanting also. Evidently, none but a pure-blooded Volsung could help him in his work of revenge, and Signy, realizing this, resolved to commit a crime. And once in the dark she murmured, "Where then was the ancient song that the gods were but twin-born once, and deemed it nothing wrong to mingle for the world's sake? Whence had the Aesir birth, and the Vanir, and the dwarf kind, and all the folk of earth?" This resolution taken, she summoned the beautiful young witch, exchanged forms with her, and running into the forest, sought shelter in Sigmund's hut. Deeming her nothing but the gypsy she seemed, and won by her coquetry, he soon made her his wife. 3 days later she vanished from his hut, returned to the palace, resumed her own form, and when she gave birth to a little son, She rejoiced to see his bold glance and strong frame. Sinfjotli. When this child, Sinfjotli, was 10 years of age, she herself made a preliminary test of his courage by sewing his garment to his skin. Then she suddenly snatched it off with shreds of flesh hanging to it, and as the child did not even wince, but laughed aloud, she confidently sent him to Sigmund. He too found the boy quite fearless, and upon leaving the hut one day, he bade him take meal from a certain sack and knead and bake the bread. On returning home, Sigmund asked Sinfjotli whether his orders had been carried out. The lad replied by showing the bread, and when closely questioned, he artlessly confessed that he had been obliged to knead into the loaf a great adder which was hidden in the meal. Pleased to see that the child, for whom he felt a strange affection, had successfully stood the test which had daunted his predecessors, Sigmund bade him refrain from eating of that loaf, as he alone could taste poison unharmed, and patiently began to teach him all a northern warrior need to know. For here the tale of the elders doth men a marvel to wit, that such was the shaping of Sigmund among all earthly kings, that unhurt he handled adders and other deadly things, and might drink unscathed of venom. But Sinfjotli was so wrought that no sting of creeping creatures would harm his body aught. The Werewolves. Sigmund and Sinfjotli soon became inseparable companions, and while ranging the forest together, they once came to a hut where they found 2 men sound asleep. Wolfskins hanging near them immediately made them conclude that the strangers were werewolves, men whom a cruel spell forced to assume the habits and guise of ravenous wolves, and who could only resume their natural form for a short space at a time. Prompted by curiosity, Sigmund donned one of the wolfskins, Sinfjotli the other, and they were soon metamorphosed into wolves and rushed through the forest, slaying and devouring all they saw. Such were their wolfish passions that they soon attacked each other, and after a fierce struggle, Sinfjotli the younger and weaker fell down dead. This sudden catastrophe brought Sigmund to his senses. While he hung over his murdered companion in sudden despair, he saw 2 weasels come out of the forest and fight until one lay dead. The live weasel then sprang back into the thicket, and soon returned with a leaf, which it laid upon its companion's breast. At the contact of the magic herb, the dead beast came back to life. A moment later, a raven flying overhead dropped a similar leaf at Sigmund's feet, and he, understanding that the gods wished to help him, laid it upon Sinfjotli, who was restored to life. Afraid lest they might work each other further mischief while in this altered guise, Sigmund and Sinfjotli now crept home and patiently waited until the time of release had come. On the 9th night the skins dropped off, and they hastily flung them into the fire, where they were entirely consumed, and the spell was broken forever. It was now that Sigmund confided the story of his wrongs to Sinfjotli, who swore that, although Sigurd was his father, for neither he nor Sigmund knew the secret of his birth, he would help him to take his revenge. At nightfall, therefore, he accompanied Sigmund to the palace. They entered unseen, and concealed themselves in the cellar, behind the huge beer vats. Here they were discovered by Signy's 2 youngest children, who were playing with golden rings, which rolled into the cellar, and who thus suddenly came upon the men in ambush. They loudly proclaimed the discovery they had just made to their father and his guests, but before Sigurd and his men could don their arms, Signy caught both children by the hand, and dragging them into the cellar, bade her brother slay the little traitors. This Sigmund utterly refused to do, but Sinfjotli struck off their heads ere he turned to fight against the assailants, who were rapidly closing around him. In spite of all efforts, Sigmund and his brave young companion soon fell into the hands of the Goths, whose king, Sigurd, sentenced them to be buried alive in the same mound, a stone partition being erected between them, so they could neither see nor touch each other. The prisoners were already confined in their living graves, and the men were about to place the last stones on the roof, when Signy drew near, bearing a bundle of straw, which they allowed her to throw at Sinfjotli's feet, for they fancied that it contained only a few provisions, which would prolong his agony a little without helping him to escape. When the workmen had departed, and all was still, Sinfjotli undid the sheaf, and shouted for joy when he found instead of bread the sword which Odin had given to Sigmund. Knowing that nothing could dull or break the keen edge of this fine weapon, Sinfjotli thrust it through the stone partition, and aided by Sigmund, sought an opening, and both soon effected an escape through the roof. Then in the grave mound's darkness did Sigmund the king upstand, and unto that saw of battle he set his naked hand. And hard the gift of Odin home to their breasts they drew, sought Sigmund, sought Sinfjotli, till the stone was cleft a'two. And they met and kissed together, then they hewed and heaved full hard, till lo, through the bursten rafters the winter heavens bestarred. And they leap out merry-hearted, nor is there need to say a many words between them of whither was the way. Sigmund's vengeance. Sigmund and Sinfjotli, free once more, noiselessly sought the palace, piled combustible materials around it, and setting fire to it, placed themselves on either side the door, declaring that none but the women should be allowed to pass through. Then they loudly called to Signy to escape ere it was too late, but she had no desire to live, and after kissing them both and revealing the secret of Sinfjotli's birth, she sprang back into the flames, where she perished. And then King Siggeir's roof-tree upheaved for its utmost fall, and its huge walls clashed together, and its mean and lowly things the fire of death confounded with the tokens of the kings. Helgi. The long-planned vengeance had finally been carried out, Volsung's death had been avenged, and Sigmund, feeling that nothing now detained him in Gothland, set sail with Sinfjotli and returned to Hunaland, where he was warmly welcomed and again set under the shade of his ancestral tree, the mighty Brandstock. His authority fully established, Sigmund married Borghild, a beautiful princess, who bore him 2 sons, Hamond and Helgi, the latter of whom was visited by the Norns when he lay in his cradle, and promised sumptuous entertainment in Valhalla when his earthly career should be ended. And the woman was fair and lovely, and bore him sons of fame. Men called them Hamond and Helgi, and when Helgi first saw light, there came the Norns to his cradle, and gave him life full bright, and called him sunlit hill, sharp sword, and land of rings, and bade him be lovely and great, and a joy in the tale of kings. This young Volsung prince was fostered by Hagal, for northern kings generally entrusted their sons' education to a stranger, thinking they would be treated with less indulgence than at home. Under this tuition, Helgi became so fearless that at the age of 15 he ventured alone into the palace of Hunding, with whose whole race his family was at feud. Passing all through the palace unmolested and unrecognized, he left an insolent message, which so angered Hunding that he immediately set out in pursuit of the bold young prince. Hunding entered Hagal's house, and would have made Helgi a prisoner had the youth not disguised himself as a servant-maid, and begun to grind corn as if it were his wonted occupation. The invaders marveled somewhat at the maid's tall stature and brawny arms, but departed without suspecting that they had been so near the hero whom they sought. Having thus cleverly escaped, Helgi joined Sinfjotli. They collected an army and marched openly against the Hundings, with whom they fought a great battle, during which the Valkyrs hovered overhead, waiting to convey the slain to Valhalla. Gudrun, one of the battle maidens, was so charmed by the courage which Helgi displayed that she openly sought him and promised to be his wife. Only one of the Hunding race, Dag, remained alive, and he was allowed to go free after promising never to try to avenge his kinsman's death. This promise was not kept, however, for Dag, having borrowed Odin's spear Gungnir, treacherously made use of it to slay Helgi. Gudrun, now his wife, wept many tears at his death, and solemnly cursed his murderer. Then, hearing from one of her maids that her slain husband kept calling for her in the depths of his tomb, she fearlessly entered the mound at night, and tenderly inquired why he called, and why his wounds kept on bleeding even after death. Helgi answered that he could not rest happy because of her grief, and declared that for every tear she shed, a drop of his blood must flow. Thou weepest, gold adorned, cruel tears, sun-bright daughter of the South, ere to sleep thou goest, each one falls bloody on the prince's breast, wet, cold, and piercing, with sorrow big. Sigmund's Edda, Thorpe's translation. To still her beloved husband's sufferings, Gudrun then ceased to weep, but her spirit soon joined his, which had ridden over Bifrost and entered Valhalla, where Odin made him leader of the Einherjar. Here Gudrun, a Valkyr once more, continued to wait upon him, darting down to earth at Odin's command to seek new recruits for the army which her lord was to lead into battle when Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, should come. Death of Sinfjotli. Sinfjotli, Sigmund's eldest son, also came to an early death, for having quarrelled with and slain Borghild's brother, she determined to poison him. Twice Sinfjotli detected the attempt, and told his father there was poison in his cup. Twice Sigmund, whom no venom could injure, drained the bowl, but when Borghild made a third and last attempt, he bade Sinfjotli let the wine flow through his beard. Mistaking the meaning of his father's words, Sinfjotli immediately drained the cup and fell to the ground, lifeless, for the poison was of the most deadly kind. He drank as he spake the words, and forthwith the venom ran in a chill flood over his heart, and down fell the mighty man, with never an uttered death word, and never a death-changed look, and the floor of the hall of the Volsungs beneath his falling shook. Then uprose the Elder of Days with a great and bitter cry, and lifted the head of the fallen, and none durst come anigh, to hearken the words of his sorrow, if any words he said, but such as the father of all men might speak over Balder dead. And again as before the death-stroke, waxed the hall of the Volsungs dim, and once more he seemed in the forest, where he spake with naught but him. Speechless with grief, Sigmund tenderly raised his son's body in his arms, and strode out of the hall and down to the shore, where he deposited his precious burden in the skiff of an old one-eyed boatman who came at his call. But when he would fain have stepped aboard also, the boatman pushed off and was soon lost to sight. The bereaved father then slowly wended his way home again, knowing that Odin himself had come to claim the young hero, and had rowed away with him out into the west. Hjordis. Sigmund repudiated Borghild in punishment for this crime, and when he was very old indeed, he sued for the hand of Hjordis, a fair young princess, daughter of Eglimi, king of the islands. Although this young maiden had many suitors, among others King Ligni of Hunding's race, she gladly accepted Sigmund, and became his wife. Ligni, the discarded suitor, was so angry at this decision that he immediately collected an army and marched against his successful rival, who, overpowered by superior numbers, fought with the courage of despair. Hidden in a neighboring thicket, Hjordis and her maid anxiously watched the battle, saw Sigmund pile the dead around him, and triumph over every foe, until at last a tall, one-eyed warrior suddenly appeared, broke his matchless sword, and vanished, leaving him defenceless amid the foe, who soon cut him down. But lo, through the hedge of the war-shafts a mighty man there came, one-eyed and seeming ancient, but his visage shone like flame. Gleaming grey was his kirtle, and his hood was cloudy blue, and he bore a mighty twibil, as he waded the fight-sheaves through, and stood face to face with Sigmund, and upheaved the bill to smite. Once more round the head of the Volsung fierce glittered the brand-stock's light, the sword that came from Odin, and Sigmund's cry once more rang out to the very heavens, above the din of war. Then clashed the meeting edges with Sigmund's latest stroke, and in shivering shards fell earthward that fear of worldly folk. But changed were the eyes of Sigmund, the war wrath left his face, for that grey-clad mighty helper was gone, and in his place drave on the unbroken spear-wood 'gainst the Volsung's empty hands. And there they smote down Sigmund, the wonder of all lands. On the foeman, on the death-heap, his steeds had piled that day. All the Volsung race and army had already succumbed, So Ligny immediately left the battlefield to hasten on and take possession of the kingdom and palace, where he fully expected to find the fair Hjordis and force her to become his wife. As soon as he had gone, however, the beautiful young queen crept out of her hiding place in the thicket, ran to the dying Sigmund, caught him to her breast in a last passionate embrace, and tearfully listened to his dying words. He then bade her gather up the fragments of his sword, carefully treasure them, and give them to the son whom he foretold would soon be born, and who was destined to avenge his death and be far greater than he. I have wrought for the Volsungs truly, and yet have I known full well that a better one than I am shall bear the tale to tell. And for him shall these shards be smithied, and he shall be my son, to remember what I have forgotten, and to do what I left undone. Elf the Viking. While Hjordis was mourning over Sigmund's lifeless body, her watching handmaiden warned her of the approach of a party of Vikings. Retreating into the thicket once more, Hjordis exchanged garments with her, then bidding her walk first and personate the queen, they went to meet the Viking Elf, Helfrad or Helfrich, and so excited his admiration for Sigmund that he buried him with all pomp, and promised them a safe asylum in his house. As he had doubted their relative positions from the very first moment, he soon resorted to a seemingly idle question to ascertain their real rank. The pretended queen, when asked how she knew the hour had come for rising when the winter days were short and there was no light to announce the coming of morn, replied that, as she was in the habit of drinking milk ere she fed the cows, she always awoke thirsty. But when the same question was put to the real Hjordis, she answered that she knew it was morning because the golden ring her father had given her grew cold on her hand. Sigurd. Elf, having thus discovered the true state of affairs, offered marriage to the pretended handmaiden Hjordis, promising to foster her child by Sigmund, a promise which he nobly kept. The child was sprinkled with water by his hand, a ceremony which our pagan ancestors scrupulously performed, received from him the name of Sigurd, and grew up in the palace. There he was treated as the king's own son, receiving his education from Regin, the wisest of men, who knew all things, and was even aware of his own fate, which was to fall by a youth's hand. Again in the house of the Helper there dwelt a certain man, beardless and low of stature, of visage pinched and wan. So exceeding old was Regin that no son of man could tell in what year of the days passed over he came to that land to dwell. But the youth of King Elf had he fostered, and the Helper's youth thereto, yea, and his father's fathers, the lore of all men he knew, and was deft in every cunning, save the dealings of the sword. So sweet was his tongue-speech fashioned, that men trode his every word. His hand with the harp-strings blended was the mingler of delight, with the latter days of sorrow, all tales he told aright. The master of the masters, in the smithying craft was he, and he dealt with the wind and the weather, and the stilling of the sea. Nor might any learn him leechcraft, for before that race was made, and that man-folk's generation, all their life-days had he weighed. Under this tutor young Sigurd grew up to great wisdom. He mastered the smithcraft and the art of carving all manner of runes, learned languages, music, and eloquence, and, last but not least, became a doughty warrior whom none could subdue. By Regin's advice, Sigurd, having reached manhood, asked the king for a war-horse, a request which was immediately granted, for he was bidden hasten to Gripir, the stud-keeper, and choose from his flock the steed he liked best. On his way to the meadow, where the horses were at pasture, Sigurd encountered a one-eyed stranger, clad in grey and blue, who bade him drive the horses into the river, and select the one which could breast the foaming tide most successfully. Sigurd, acting according to this advice, noticed that one horse, after crossing, raced around the meadow on the opposite side, then plunging back into the river, he returned to his former pasture without showing any signs of fatigue. The young hero selected this horse, therefore, calling him Grain or Greyfell. This steed was a descendant of Odin's 8-footed horse Sleipnir, and besides being unusually strong and indefatigable, was as fearless as his master. A short time after this, while Regin and his pupil were sitting over the fire, the former struck his harp, and after the manner of the northern skalds, sang or recited the following tale, which was the story of his life. The Treasure of the Dwarf King. Hreidmar, king of the dwarf folk, was the father of 3 sons. Fafnir, the eldest, was gifted with a fearless soul and a powerful hand. Otter, the second, with snare and net, and the power of changing form at will, and Regin, the third, could, as we have already seen, command all knowledge and skilfully ply the trade of a smith. To please the avaricious old Hreidmar, this youngest son fashioned for him a house which was all lined with glittering gold and flashing gems, and guarded by Fafnir, whose fierce glances and aegis helmet none dared encounter. Now it came to pass that Odin, Honir, and Loki once came down upon earth in human guise for one of their wonted expeditions to test the hearts of men, and soon reached the land where Hreidmar dwelt. And the 3 were the hard-wise Odin, the father of the slain, and Loki, the world's begrudger, who maketh all labour vain, and Honir, the utter blameless, who wrought the hope of man, and his heart and inmost yearnings, when first the work began. The god that was aforetime, and hereafter yet shall be, when the new light yet undreamed of shall shine over earth and sea. These gods had not wandered very far before Loki perceived an otter basking in the sun. Animated by his usual spirit of destruction, he slew the unoffending beast, which, as it happened, was the dwarf king's second son, Otter, and flung its lifeless body over his shoulders, thinking it would furnish a good dish when mealtime came. Following his companions, Loki came at last to Hreidmar's house, entered with them, and flung his burden down upon the floor. The moment the dwarf king's glance fell upon it, he flew into a towering rage, and before the gods could help themselves they were bound by his order, and heard him declare that they should never recover their liberty unless they could satisfy his thirst for gold by giving him enough of that precious substance to cover the otter skin inside and out. Now hearken the doom I shall speak. Ye stranger folk shall be free when ye give me the flame of the waters, the gathered gold of the sea, that Andvari hideth rejoicing in the one realm pale as the grave, and the master of sleight shall fetch it, and the hand that never gave, and the heart that begrudges forever shall gather and give and rue. Lo, this is the doom of the wise, and no doom shall be spoken anew. As this otter skin had the property of stretching itself out to a fabulous size, no ordinary treasure could suffice to cover it. The gods therefore bade Loki, who was liberated to procure the ransom, hasten off to the waterfall where the dwarf Andvari dwelt, and secure the treasure he had amassed by magical means. There is a desert of dread in the uttermost part of the world, where over a wall of mountains is a mighty water hurled, whose hidden head none knoweth, nor where it meeteth the sea, and that force is the force of Andvari, and an elf of the dark is he. In the cloud and the desert he dwelleth, amid that land alone, and his work is the storing of treasure within his house of stone. In spite of diligent search, however, Loki could not find the dwarf, but perceiving a salmon sporting in the foaming waters, he shrewdly concluded the dwarf must have assumed this shape, and borrowing Ran's net, he soon had the fish in his power. As he had suspected, it was Andvari, who in exchange for liberty reluctantly brought forth his mighty treasure, and surrendered it all, including the helmet of dread and a hauberk of gold, reserving only the ring he wore, which was gifted with miraculous powers, and like a magnet helped him to collect the precious ore. But the greedy Loki, catching sight of it, wrenched it away from him, and departed laughing, while the dwarf hurled angry curses after him, declaring that the ring would ever prove its possessor's bane, and would cause the death of many. That gold which the dwarf possessed shall to 2 brothers be cause of death, and to 8 princes of dissension. From my wealth no one shall good derive. Seigmund's Edda, Thorpe's translation. On arriving at Hreidmar's hut, Loki found the mighty treasure none too great for the skin widened and spread, and he was even forced to give the ring Andvaranaut, Andvaris loom, to purchase his and his companions' release. The gold thus obtained soon became a curse, as Andvari had predicted, for Fafnir and Regin both coveted a share. As for Reitmar, he gloated over his treasure night and day, and Fafnir the Invincible, seeing that he could not obtain it otherwise, slew his own father, donned the helmet of dread and the hauberk of gold, grasped the sword Hrotti, and when Regin came to claim a part, drove him scornfully out into the world, where he bade him earn his own living. Thus exiled, Regin took refuge among men, to whom he taught the arts of sowing and reaping. He showed them how to work metals, sail the seas, tame horses, yoke beasts of burden, build houses, spin, weave, and sew, in short, all the industries of civilized life, which had hitherto been unknown. Years elapsed, and Regin patiently bided his time, hoping that some day he would find a hero strong enough to avenge his wrongs upon Fafnir, whom years of gloating over his treasure had changed into a horrible dragon, the terror of Gnitaheid, Glittering Heath, where he had taken up his abode. His story finished, Regin suddenly turned to the attentive Sigurd, told him he knew that he could slay the dragon if he wished, and inquired whether he were ready to help his old tutor avenge his wrongs. And he spake, Hast thou hearkened, Sigurd? Wilt thou help a man that is old to avenge him for his father? Wilt thou win that treasure of gold, and be more than the kings of the earth? Wilt thou rid the earth of a wrong, and heal the woe and the sorrow my heart hath endured over long? End of section 26. Section 27 of Myths of Northern Lands. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sonia. Myths of Northern Lands by H. A. Guerber. The Sigurd Saga. Part 2. Sigurd's Sword. Sigurd immediately assented, declaring, however, that the curse must be assumed by Regin, for he would have none of it, and in order to be well prepared for the coming fight, he asked his master to forge him a sword which no blow could break. Twice Regin fashioned the marvelous weapon, but twice Sigurd broke it to pieces on the anvil. Then, declaring that he must have a sword which would not fail him in time of need, he begged the broken fragments of Sigmund's weapon from his mother Hjordis, and either forged himself or made Regin forge a matchless blade, whose temper was such that it neatly severed some wool floating gently down the stream, and divided the great anvil in two without being even dinted. After paying a farewell visit to Gripir, who, knowing the future, foretold every event in his coming career, Sigurd took leave of his mother, and, accompanied by Regin, set sail from his native land, promising to slay the dragon as soon as he had fulfilled his first duty, which was to avenge his father Sigmund's death. First wilt thou, prince, avenge thy father, and for the wrongs of Eglimi wilt retaliate. Thou wilt the cruel, the sons of Hunding, boldly lay low. Thou wilt have victory. Lay of Sigurd Fafnicide. Thorpe's translation. On his way to the Volsung land, Sigurd saw a man walking on the waters, and took him on board, little suspecting that this individual, who said his name was Feng or Fjolnir, was Odin or Hnikar, the wave-stiller. He therefore conversed freely with the stranger, who promised him favorable winds, and learned from him how to distinguish auspicious from unauspicious omens. The fight with the dragon. After slaying Ligni and cutting the bloody eagle on his foes, Sigurd left his reconquered kingdom and went with Regin to slay Fafnir. A long ride through the mountains, which rose higher and higher before him, brought him at last to his goal, where a one-eyed stranger bade him dig trenches in the middle of the track along which the dragon daily rolled his slimy length to go down to the river and quench his thirst. He then bade Sigurd cower in one of those holes, and there wait until the monster passed over him, when he could drive his trusty weapon straight into his heart. Sigurd gratefully followed this advice, and as the monster's loathsome, slimy folds rolled overhead, he thrust his sword under its left breast, and deluged with blood, sprang out of the trench as the dragon rolled aside in the throes of death. Then all sank into silence, and the son of Sigmund stood on the torn and furrowed desert by the pool of Fafnir's blood, and the serpent lay before him, dead, chilly, dull, and grey, and over the glittering heath fair shone the sun and the day, and the light wind followed the sun, and breathed over the fateful place, as fresh as it furrows the sea-plain, or bows the acre's face. Regin, who had prudently remained at a distance until all danger was over, seeing his foe was slain, now came up to Sigurd, and fearing lest the strong young conqueror should glory in his deed and claim a reward, he began to accuse him of having murdered his kin, and declared that instead of requiring life for life, as was his right according to northern law, he would consider it sufficient atonement if Sigurd would cut out the monster's heart and roast it for him on a spit. Then Regin spake to Sigurd, "Of this slaying wilt thou be free? Then gather thou fire together, and roast the heart for me, that I may eat it and live, and be thy master and more, for therein was might and wisdom, and the grudged and hoarded lore. Or else depart on thy ways, afraid from the glittering heath." Sigurd, knowing that a true warrior never refused satisfaction of some kind to the kindred of the slain, immediately prepared to act as cook, while Regin dozed until the meat was ready. Feeling of the heart to ascertain whether it were tender, Sigurd burnt his fingers so severely that he instinctively thrust them into his mouth to allay the smart. No sooner had Fafnir's blood touched his lips than he discovered, to his utter surprise, that he could understand the songs of the birds, which were already gathering around the carrion. Listening to them attentively, he found they were advising him to slay Regin, appropriate the gold, eat the heart, and drink the blood of the dragon. And as this advice entirely coincided with his own wishes, he lost no time in executing it. A small portion of Fafnir's heart was reserved for future consumption, ere he wandered off in search of the mighty hoard. Then, after donning the helmet of dread, the hauberk of gold, and the ring Andvaranaut, and loading Greyfell with as much ruddy gold as he could carry, Sigurd sprang on his horse, listening eagerly to the birds' songs to know what he had best undertake next. The Sleeping Warrior Maiden. Soon he heard them sing of a warrior maiden fast asleep on a mountain, and all surrounded by a glittering barrier of flames, through which only the bravest of men could pass in order to arouse her. On the fell I know a warrior maid to sleep, over her waves the linden's bane, eke whilom stuck, a sleep-thorn in the robe of the maid who would heroes choose. Lay of Fafnir, Thorpe's translation. After riding for a long while through trackless regions, Sigurd at last came to the Hindarfjall in Frankland, a tall mountain whose cloud-wreathed summit seemed circled by fiery flames. Long Sigurd rideth the waste, when lo, on a morning of day, from out of the tangled crag-walls, amidst the cloudland grey, comes up a mighty mountain, and it is as though there burns a torch amidst of its cloud-wreath. So thither Sigurd turns, for he deems indeed from its topmost to look on the best of the earth, and Greyfell neigheth beneath him, and his heart is full of mirth. Riding straight up this mountain, he saw the light grow more and more vivid, and soon a barrier of lurid flames stood before him. But although the fire crackled and roared, it could not daunt our hero, who plunged bravely into its very midst. Now Sigurd turns in his saddle, and the hilt of the wrath he shifts, and draws a girth the tighter, then the gathered reins he lifts, and crieth aloud to Greyfell, and rides at the wildfire's heart. But the white wall wavers before him, and the flame flood rushes apart, and high over his head it riseth, and wide and wild its roar, as it beareth the mighty tidings to the very heavenly floor. But he rideth through its roaring as the warrior rides the rye, when it bows with the wind of the summer, and the hid spears draw anigh. The white flame licks his raiment, and sweeps through Greyfell's mane, and bathes both hands of Sigurd, and the hilt of Fafnir's bane, and winds about his war-helm, and mingles with his hair. But naught his raiment dusketh, or dims his glittering gear. Then it fails and fades and darkens, till all seems left behind, and dawn and the blaze is swallowed in mid-murk stark and blind. No sooner had Sigurd thus fearlessly sprung into the very heart of the flames than the fire flickered and died out, leaving nothing but a broad circle of white ashes, through which he rode until he came to a great castle with shield-hung walls, in which he penetrated unchallenged, for the gates were wide open, and no warders or men-at-arms were to be seen. Proceeding cautiously, for he feared some snare, Sigurd at last came to the centre of the enclosure, where he saw a recumbent form all cased in armour. To remove the helmet was but a moment's work, but Sigurd started back in surprise when he beheld, instead of a warrior, the sleeping face of a most beautiful woman. All his efforts to awaken her were quite vain, however, until he had cut the armour off her body, and she lay before him in pure white linen garments, her long golden hair rippling and waving around her. As the last fastening of her armour gave way, she opened wide her beautiful eyes, gazed in rapture upon the rising sun, and after greeting it with enthusiasm, she turned to her deliverer, whom she loved at first sight as he loved her. Then she turned and gazed on Sigurd, and her eyes met the Volsung's eyes, and mighty and measureless now did the tide of his love arise, for their longing had met and mingled, and he knew of her heart that she loved, and she spake unto nothing but him, and her lips with the speech-flood moved. The maiden now proceeded to inform Sigurd that she was Brunhild, according to some authorities the daughter of an earthly king. Odin had raised her to the rank of a Valkyr, in which capacity she had served him faithfully for a long while. But once she had ventured to set her own wishes above his, and instead of leaving the victory to the old king for whom he had designated it, had favored his younger and therefore more attractive opponent. In punishment for this act of disobedience, she was deprived of her office and banished to earth, where All-Father decreed she must marry like any other member of her sex. This sentence filled Brunhild's heart with dismay, for she greatly feared lest it might be her fate to mate with a coward whom she would despise. To quiet these apprehensions, Odin placed her on Hindarfjall, or Hindfell, stung her with the thorn of sleep, that she might await in unchanged youth and beauty the coming of her destined husband, and surrounded her with a barrier of flame, which none but the bravest would venture to pass through. From the top of the Hindarfjall, Brunhild now pointed out to Sigurd her former home, at Limdale or Hunaland, telling him he would find her there whenever he chose to come and claim her as his wife, and then, while they stood on the lonely mountain top together, Sigurd placed the ring Andvaranaut upon her hand, in sign of betrothal, swearing to love her alone as long as life endured. From his hand then draweth Sigurd Andvari's ancient gold. There is naught but the sky above them, as the ring together they hold, the shapen ancient token that hath no change nor end, no change and no beginning, no flaw for God to mend. Then Sigurd cries, O Brunhild, now hearken while I swear that the sun shall die in the heavens, and the day no more be fair, if I seek not love in Limdale, and the house that fostered thee, and the land where thou awakedst, twixt the woodland and the sea. And she cried, O Sigurd, Sigurd, now hearken while I swear that the day shall die forever, and the sun to blackness wear, ere I forget thee, Sigurd, as I lie twixt wood and sea, in the little land of Limdale, and the house that fostered me. The fostering of Aslog. According to some authorities, after thus plighting their troth, the lovers parted. According to others, Sigurd soon sought out and married Brunhild, with whom he lived for a while in perfect happiness, until forced to leave her and his infant daughter Aslog. This child, left orphaned at 3 years of age, was fostered by Brunhild's father, who, driven away from home, concealed her in a cunningly fashioned harp, until reaching a distant land, he was murdered by a peasant couple for the sake of the gold they supposed it to contain. Their surprise and disappointment were great indeed when, on breaking the instrument open, they found a beautiful little girl, whom they deemed mute, as she would not speak a word. Time passed on, and the child whom they had trained to do all their labor grew up to be a beautiful maiden who won the affections of a passing Viking, Ragnar Lodbrok, king of the Danes, to whom she told her tale. After a year's probation, during which he won glory in many lands, he came back and married her. She heard a voice she deemed well known, long waited through dull hours bygone, and round her mighty arms were cast. But when her trembling red lips passed from out the heaven of that dear kiss, and eyes met eyes, she saw in his fresh pride, fresh hope, fresh love, and saw the long sweet days still onward draw, themselves still going hand in hand, as now they went adown the strand. The Fostering of Aslog, William Morris. The story of Sigurd and Brunhild did not end on the Hinderfjall, however, for the hero soon went to seek adventures in the great world, where he had vowed, in true knightly fashion, to right the wrong and defend the fatherless and oppressed. The Nibelungs. In the course of his wanderings, Sigurd finally came to the land of the Nibelungs, the land of continual mist, where Giuki and Grimhild were king and queen. The latter was specially powerful, as she was well versed in magic lore, and could not only weave spells and mutter incantations, but could also concoct marvelous potions, which would steep the drinker in temporary forgetfulness, and make him yield to whatever she wished. The Nibelung king was father of 3 sons, Gunnar, Högni, and Guttorm, who were brave young men, and of 1 daughter, Gudrun, the gentlest as well as the most beautiful of maidens. Sigurd was warmly welcomed by Giuki, and invited to tarry a while. He accepted the invitation, shared all the pleasures and occupations of the Nibelungs, even accompanying them to war, where he distinguished himself by his valor, and so won the admiration of Grimhild, that she resolved to secure him as her daughter's husband at any price. She therefore brewed one of her magic potions, which she bade Gudrun give him, and when he had partaken of it, he utterly forgot Brunhild and his plighted troth, and gazed upon Gudrun with an admiration which by the queen's machinations was soon changed to ardent love. But the heart was changed in Sigurd, as though it never had been. His love of Brynhild perished, as he gazed on the Nibelung queen. Brynhild's beloved body was even as a wasted hearth, no more for bale or blessing, for plenty or for dearth. Although haunted by a vague dread that he had forgotten something important, Sigurd asked for and obtained Gudrun's hand, and celebrated his wedding amid the rejoicings of the people who loved him very dearly. He gave his bride some of Fafnir's heart to eat, and the moment she had tasted it, her nature was changed, and she began to grow cold and silent to all except him. Sigurd further cemented his alliance with the eldest 2 Giukings, as the sons of Giuki were called, by stepping down into the doom ring with them, cutting out a sword which was placed upon a shield, beneath which they stood, while they bared and slightly cut their right arms, and allowing their blood to mingle in the fresh earth over which the sod was again laid after they had sworn eternal friendship. But although Sigurd loved his wife and felt true brotherly affection for her brothers, he could not get rid of his haunting sense of oppression, and was seldom seen to smile as radiantly as of old. Giuki having died, Grimhild besought Gunnar, his successor, to take a wife, suggesting that none seemed more worthy to become queen of the Nibelungs than Brunhild, who, it was reported, sat in a golden hall surrounded by flames, whence she had declared she would issue only to marry the warrior who would dare pass through the fire to her side. Gunnar's stratagem. Gunnar immediately prepared to seek this bride, and strengthened by one of his mother's magic potions, and encouraged by Sigurd, who accompanied him, he felt very confident of success. But when he would daringly have ridden straight into the fire, his steed drew back affrighted, and he could not induce him to advance a step. Seeing that Greyfell did not flinch, he asked him of Sigurd. But although the steed allowed Gunnar to mount, he would not stir unless his master were on his back. Gunnar, disappointed, sprang to earth and accepted Sigurd's proposal to assume his face and form, ride through the flames, and woo the bride by proxy. This deception could easily be carried out, thanks to the helmet of dread, and to a magic potion which Grimhild had given Gunnar. The transformation having been brought about, Greyfell bounded through the flames with his master, and bore him to the palace door, where he dismounted, and entering the large hall came into the presence of Brunhild, whom he failed to recognize, owing to Grimhild's spell. Brunhild started back in dismay when she saw the dark-haired knight, for she had deemed it utterly impossible for any but Sigurd to cross the flames, and she, too, did not know her lover in his altered guise. Reluctantly she rose from her seat to receive him, and as she had bound herself by a solemn oath to accept as husband the man who braved the flames, she allowed him to take his lawful place by her side. Sigurd silently approached, carefully laid his drawn sword between them, and satisfied Brunhild's curiosity concerning this singular behavior by telling her that the gods had bidden him celebrate his wedding thus. There they went in one bed together, but the foster brother laid twixt him and the body of Brynhild his bright blue battle blade, and she looked and heeded it nothing, but even as the dead folk lie, with folded hands she lay there, and let the night go by. And as still lay that image of Gunnar, as the dead of life forlorn, and hand on hand he folded, as he waited for the morn. So oft in the moonlit minster your fathers may ye see, by the side of the ancient mothers, await the day to be. 3 days passed thus, and when the 4th morning dawned, Sigurd drew the ring Andvaran out from Brunhild's hand, replaced it by another, and received her solemn promise that in 10 days' time she would appear at the Nibelung court to take up her duties as queen and be a faithful wife. I thank thee, king, for thy good will, and thy pledge of love I take. Depart with my troth to thy people, but ere full 10 days are o'er, I shall come to the sons of the Nibelungs, and then shall we part no more, till the day of the change of our life days, when Odin and Freya shall call. Then Sigurd again passed out of the palace through the ashes lying white and cold, and joined Gunnar, with whom he hastened to exchange forms once more, after he had reported the success of his venture. The warriors rode homeward together, and Sigurd revealed only to Gudrun the secret of her brother's wooing, giving her the fatal ring, which he little suspected would be the cause of many woes. True to her promise, Brunhild appeared 10 days later, solemnly blessed the house she was about to enter, greeted Gunnar kindly, and allowed him to conduct her to the great hall, where she saw Sigurd seated beside Gudrun. He looked up at the selfsame moment, and as he encountered Brunhild's reproachful glance, Grimhild's spell was broken, and he was struck by an anguished recollection of the happy past. It was too late, however. They were both in honor bound, he to Gudrun, and she to Gunnar, whom she passively followed to the high seat, where she sat beside him listening to the songs of the bards. But although apparently calm, Brunhild's heart was hot with anger, and she silently nursed her wrath, often stealing out of her husband's palace to wander alone in the forest, where she could give vent to her grief. In the meanwhile, Gunnar, seeing his wife so coldly indifferent to all his protestations of affection, began to have jealous suspicions, and wondered whether Sigurd had honestly told the whole story of the wooing, and whether he had not taken advantage of his position to win Brunhild's love. Sigurd alone continued the even tenor of his way, doing good to all, fighting none but tyrants and oppressors, and cheering all he met by his kindly words and smile. Quarrel of the Queens. One day the queens went down to the Rhine to bathe, and as they were entering the water, Gudrun claimed precedence by right of her husband's courage. Brunhild refused to yield what she deemed her right, and a quarrel ensued, in the course of which Gudrun accused her sister-in-law of infidelity, producing the ring Andvaran out in support of her charge. Crushed by this revelation, Brunhild hastened homeward, and lay on her bed in speechless grief day after day, until all thought she would die. In vain did Gunnar and all the members of the royal family seek her in turn, and implore her to speak. She would not utter a word until Sigurd came and inquired the cause of her great grief. Like a long pent-up stream, her love and anger now burst forth, and she overwhelmed the hero with reproaches, until his heart swelled with grief for her sorrow, and burst the tight bands of his strong armor. Out went Sigurd from that interview into the hall of kings, writhing with anguish, so that began to start the ardent warrior's iron-woven sark off from his sides. Sigmund's Edda, Thorpe's translation. But although he even offered to repudiate Gudrun to reinstate her in her former rights, she refused to listen to his words and dismissed him, saying that she must never prove faithless to Gunnar. Her pride was such, however, that she could not endure the thought that 2 living men had called her wife, and the next time her husband sought her presence, she implored him to put Sigurd to death, thus increasing his jealousy and suspicions. He refused to grant this prayer because he had sworn good fellowship with Sigurd, and she prevailed upon Høgni to work her will. As he, too, did not wish to violate his oath, he induced Guttorm, by means of much persuasion and one of Grimhild's potions, to do the dastardly deed. Death of Sigurd. In the dead of night, Guttorm stole into Sigurd's chamber, sword in hand, but as he bent over the bed, he saw Sigurd's bright eyes fixed upon him, and fled precipitately. Later on he returned, and the same scene was repeated, but towards morning, when he stole in for the 3rd time, he found the hero asleep, and traitorously drove his spear through his back. Mortally wounded, Sigurd raised himself in bed, grasped his wonderful sword hanging beside him, flung it full at the flying murderer, and cut him in 2 just as he reached the door. His last remaining strength thus exhausted, Sigurd sank back, whispered a last farewell to the terrified Gudrun, and breathed his last. Mourn not, O Gudrun, this stroke is the last of ill. Fear leaveth the house of the Nibelungs on this breaking of the morn. Mayest thou live, O woman beloved, unforsaken, unforlorn. It is Brynhild's deed, he murmured, and the woman that loves me well. Naught now is left to repent of, and the tale abides to tell. I have done many deeds in my life days, and all these and my love they lie in the hollow hand of Odin, till the day of the world go by. I have done, and I may not undo. I have given, and I take not again. Art thou other than I, All-Father? Wilt thou gather my glory in vain? Sigurd's infant son was also slain, and poor Gudrun mourned over her dead in speechless, tearless grief, while Brunhild laughed aloud, thereby incurring the wrath of Gunnar, who repented now, but too late, of his share in the dastardly crime. While the assembled people were erecting a mighty funeral pyre, which they decorated with precious hangings, fresh flowers, and glittering arms, as was the custom for the burial of a prince, Gudrun was surrounded by women, who, seeing her tearless anguish, and fearing lest her heart would break if her tears did not flow, began to recount the bitterest sorrows they had known, one even telling of the loss of all she held dear. But their attempts to make her weep were utterly vain, until they laid her husband's head in her lap, bidding her kiss him as if he were still alive. Then her tears began to flow in torrents. The reaction soon set in for Brunhild also. Her resentment was all forgotten when she saw Sigurd laid on the pyre in all his martial array, with the burnished armor, the helmet of dread, and the trappings of his horse, which was to be burnt with him, as well as several of his faithful servants, who could not survive his loss. She withdrew to her apartment, distributed all her wealth among her handmaidens, donned her richest array, and stretching herself out upon her bed, stabbed herself. In dying accents, she then bade Gunnar lay her beside the hero she loved, with the glittering unsheathed sword between them, as it had lain when he had wooed her by proxy. When she had breathed her last, these orders were punctually executed, and both bodies were burned amid the lamentations of all the Nibelungs. They are gone, the lovely, the mighty, the hope of the ancient earth. It shall labor and bear the burden, as before that day of their birth. It shall groan in its blind abiding, for the day that Sigurd hath sped, and the hour that Brynhild has hastened, and the dawn that waketh the dead. It shall yearn and be oft-times holpen, and forget their deeds no more, till the new sun beams on Balder, and the happy seal is shore. According to another version of the story, Sigurd was treacherously slain by the Giukings while hunting in the forest, and his body was borne home by the hunters and laid at his wife's feet. Gudrun, still inconsolable, and loathing the kindred who had thus treacherously robbed her of all her joy, fled from her father's house, and took refuge with Elf, Sigurd's foster father, who, after Hjordis' death, had married Thora, the daughter of King Hakon. The two women became great friends, and here Gudrun tarried several years, working tapestry in which she embroidered the great deeds of Sigurd, and watching over her little daughter Swanhild, whose bright eyes reminded her so vividly of the husband whom she had lost. Atli, King of the Huns. In the meanwhile, Atli, Brunhild's brother, who was now King of the Huns, had sent to Gunnar to demand atonement for his sister's death, and to satisfy these claims Gunnar had promised that in due time he would give him Gudrun's hand in marriage. Time passed, and when at last Atli clamored for the fulfillment of his promise, the Nibelung brothers, with their mother Grimhild, went to seek the long-absent Gudrun, and by their persuasions and the magic potion administered by Grimhild, succeeded in persuading her to leave little Swanhild in Denmark and become Atli's wife. Gudrun dwelt, year after year, in the land of the Huns, secretly hating her husband, whose avaricious tendencies were extremely repugnant to her, and she was not even consoled for Sigurd's death and Swanhild's loss by the birth of two sons, Erp and Eitel. As she lovingly thought of the past, she often spoke of it, little suspecting that her descriptions of the wealth of the Nibelungs excited Atli's greed, and that he was secretly planning some pretext for getting it into his power. Finally he decided to send Knefrut or Wingi, one of his subjects, to invite all the Nibelung princes to visit his court, intending to slay them when he should have them at his mercy. But Gudrun, fathoming this design, sent a runic-written warning to her brothers, together with the ring Anvaranaut, around which she had twined the wolf's hair. On the way, however, the messenger partly effaced the runes, thus changing their meaning, and when he appeared before the Nibelungs, Gunnar accepted the invitation in spite of Högni's and Grimhild's warnings and the ominous dream of his new wife Glaumvor. Burial of the Nibelung treasure. Before his departure, however, they prevailed upon him to secretly bury the great Nibelung hoard in the Rhine, where it was sunk in a deep hole, the position of which was known to the royal brothers only, and which they took a solemn oath never to reveal. Down then and whirling outward, the ruddy gold fell forth, as a flame in the dim grey morning flashed out the kingdom's worth. Then the waters roared above it, the wan water and the foam flew up over the face of the rock wall as the tinkling gold fell home, unheard, unseen forever, a wonder and a tale, till the last of earthly singers from the sons of men shall fail. The treachery of Atli. In martial array they then rode out of the city of the Nibelungs, which they were never again to see, and after many unimportant adventures came into the land of the Huns, where on reaching Atli's hall, and finding themselves surrounded by foes, they slew the traitor Knefrut, and prepared to sell their lives as dearly as possible. Gudrun rushed to meet them, embraced them tenderly, and seeing that they must fight, grasped a weapon and loyally helped them in the terrible massacre which ensued. When the first onslaught was over, Gunnar kept up the spirits of his followers by playing on his harp, which he laid aside only to grasp his sword and make havoc among the foe. Thrice the brave Nibelungs resisted the assault of the Huns, ere, wounded, faint, and weary, Gunnar and Högni, now sole survivors, fell into the hands of their foes, who bound them securely and led them off to prison to await death. Atli, who had prudently abstained from taking any active part in the fight, had his brothers-in-law brought in turn before him, promising freedom if they would only reveal the hiding-place of the golden hoard. But they proudly kept silence, and it was only after much torture that Gunnar acknowledged that he had sworn a solemn oath never to reveal the secret as long as Högni lived, and declared he would believe his brother dead only when his heart was brought to him on a platter. With a dreadful voice cried Gunnar, "O fool, hast thou heard it told, who won the treasure aforetime and the ruddy rings of the gold? It was Sigurd, child of the Volsungs, the best sprung forth from the best. He rode from the north and the mountains, and became my summer guest, my friend and my brother sworn. He rode the wavering fire, and won me the Queen of Glory, and accomplished my desire. The praise of the world he was, the hope of the biders in wrong, the help of the lowly people, the hammer of the strong. Ah, oft in the world henceforward shall the tale be told of the deed, and I, even I, will tell it in the day of the Nibelung's need. For I sat night long in my armor, and when light was wide over the land, I slaughtered Sigurd my brother, and looked on the work of mine hand. And now, O mighty Atli, I have seen the Nibelung's wreck, and the feet of the faint-heart dastard have trodden Gunnar's neck. And if all be little enough, and the gods begrudge me rest, let me see the heart of Hogni cut quick from his living breast, and laid on the dish before me, and then shall I tell of the gold, and become thy servant, Atli, and my life at thy pleasure hold. Urged by greed, Atli immediately ordered that Hogni's heart should be brought, but his servants, fearing to lay hands on such a grim warrior, slew the cowardly scullion Hialli. This trembling heart called forth contemptuous words from Gunnar, who declared such a timorous organ could never have belonged to his fearless brother. But when, in answer to a second angry command from Atli, the unquivering heart of Hogni was really brought, Gunnar recognized it, and turning to the monarch, solemnly swore that since the secret now rested with him alone, it would never be revealed. The last of the Nibelungs. Livid with anger, the king bade him be thrown, with bound hands, into a den of venomous snakes, where, his harp having been flung after him in derision, Gunnar calmly sat, playing it with his toes, and lulling all the reptiles to sleep, save one only. This snake was said to be Atli's mother in disguise, and it finally bit him in the side, silencing his triumphant song forever. To celebrate the death of his foes, Atli ordered a great feast, commanding Gudrun to be present to wait upon him. Then he heartily ate and drank, little suspecting that his wife had slain both his sons, and was serving up their roasted hearts and their blood mixed with wine in cups made of their skulls. When the king and his men were intoxicated, Gudrun, according to one version of the story, set fire to the palace, and when the drunken sleepers awoke, too late to escape, she revealed all she had done, stabbed her husband, and perished in the flames with the Huns. According to another version, however, she murdered Atli with Sigurd's sword, placed his body on a ship, which she sent adrift, and then cast herself into the sea, where she was drowned. She spread out her arms as she spake it, and away from the earth she leapt, and cut off her tide of returning, for the sea waves over her swept. And their will is her will henceforward, and who knoweth the deeps of the sea, and the wealth of the bed of Gudrun, and the days that yet shall be. A third and very different version reports that Gudrun was not drowned, but was borne along by the waves to the land where Jonakur was king. There she became his wife and the mother of 3 sons, Surli, Hamdir, and Erp. She also recovered possession of her beloved daughter Swanhild, who in the meanwhile had grown into a beautiful maiden of marriageable age. Swanhild. Swanhild was finally promised to Ermenrich, king of Gothland, who sent his son Randver and one of his subjects, Sibbich, to escort the bride to his kingdom. Sibbich, who was a traitor and had planned to compass the death of the royal family that he might claim the kingdom, accused Randver of having tried to win his young stepmother's affections, and thereby so roused the anger of Ermenrich that he ordered his son to be hanged, and Swanhild to be trampled to death under the feet of wild horses. But such was the beauty of this daughter of Sigurd and Gudrun that even the wild steeds could not be urged to touch her until she had been hidden from their view under a great blanket, when they trod her to death under their cruel hoofs. Gudrun, hearing of this, called her 3 sons to her side, and provided them with armor and weapons against which nothing but stone could prevail. Then, after bidding them depart and avenge their murdered sister, she died of grief, and was burned on a great pyre. The 3 youths, Surli, Hamdir, and Erp, invaded Ermenrich's kingdom, but the 2 eldest, deeming Erp too young to assist them, taunted him with his small size, and finally slew him. They then attacked Ermenrich, cut off his hands and feet, and would have slain him, had not a one-eyed stranger suddenly appeared and bidden the bystanders throw stones at the young invaders. His orders were immediately carried out, and Surli and Hamdir both fell under the shower of stones, which alone had power to injure them, according to Gudrun's words. Ye have heard of Sigurd aforetime, how the foes of God he slew, How forth from the darksome desert the gold of the waters he drew. How he wakened love on the mountain, and wakened Brynhild the bright, and dwelt upon earth for a season, and shone in all men's sight. Ye have heard of the cloudy people, and the dimming of the day, and the latter world's confusion, and Sigurd gone away. Now ye know of the need of the Nibelungs, and the end of broken troth, all the death of kings and of kindreds, and the sorrow of Odin the Goth. Interpretation of the Saga. This story of the Volsungs is supposed by some authorities to be a series of sun myths, in which Sigi, Rerir, Volsung, Sigmund, and Sigurd in turn personify the glowing orb of day. They are all armed with invincible swords, the sunbeams, and all travel through the world fighting against their foes, the demons of cold and darkness. Sigurd, like Balder, is beloved of all. He marries Brunhild, the Dawn Maiden, whom he finds in the midst of flames, the flush of morn, and parts from her only to find her again when his career is ended. His body is burned on the funeral pyre, which, like Balder's, represents either the setting sun or the last gleam of summer, of which he too is a type. The slaying of Fafnir is the destruction of the demon of cold or darkness, who has stolen the golden hoard of summer or the yellow rays of the sun. According to other authorities, this saga is based upon history. Atli is the cruel Attila, the scourge of God, while Gunnar is Gundicarius, a Burgundian monarch, whose kingdom was destroyed by the Huns, and who was slain with his brothers in 451. Gudrun is the Burgundian princess Ildiko, who slew her husband on her wedding night, as has already been related, using the glittering blade which had once belonged to the sun god to avenge her murdered kinsman. End of section 27.
Section 28 of Myths of Northern Lands. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Phil Baxter. Myths of Northern Lands by H.A. Guerber. The Twilight of the Gods. One of the distinctive features of northern mythology is that the people always believed that their gods belonged to the finite race. The Aesir had had a beginning, therefore it was reasoned they must have an end, and as they were born from a mixture of the divine and gigantic elements, and were imperfect, they bore within them the germ of death, and were, like men, doomed to endure physical death to attain spiritual immortality. The whole scheme of northern mythology was therefore a drama, every step leading gradually to the climax or tragic end, when, with true poetic justice, punishment and reward were impartially meted out. In the foregoing chapters, the gradual rise and decline of the gods has been carefully traced. We have recounted how the Aesir tolerated the presence of evil, personated by Loki. In their midst, how they weakly followed his advice, allowed him to involve them in all manner of difficulties, from which they could be extricated only at the price of some of their virtue or peace, and finally permitted him to gain such ascendancy over them that he dared rob them of their dearest possession, purity or innocence, as personified by Balder the Good. Too late now, the gods realized what an evil spirit had found a home among them, and banished Loki to earth, where men, following the god's example, listened to his teachings, and instead of cultivating virtue, became addicted to crime. Brothers slay brothers, sisters children, shed each other's blood. Hard is the world, sensual sin grows huge. There are sword ages, axe ages, shields are cleft in twain, storm ages, murder ages, till the world falls dead, and men no longer spare or pity one another. Norse Mythology, R.B. Anderson. Seeing crime rampant and all good banished from the earth, the gods realized that the prophecies uttered long before were about to be fulfilled, and that their downfall, Ragnarok, the twilight or dusk of the gods, would soon come to pass. Sol and Mani grew pale with horror, and tremblingly drove their chariots along their appointed paths, gazing with fear behind them at the pursuing wolves, which would shortly overtake and devour them. And as their smiles disappeared, the earth grew sad and cold, and the terrible Fimble winter began. Then snow fell from the 4 points of the compass at once, the biting wind swept down from the north, and all the earth was covered with a thick layer of ice. Grim Fimble raged, and o'er the world tempestuous winds and snowstorms hurled. The roaring ocean icebergs ground, and flung its frozen foam around. E'en to the top of mountain height, no warming air, nor radiance fair, of gentle summer's softening light, tempered this dreadful glacial night. Valhalla, J.C. Jones. This severe winter lasted during 3 whole seasons without a break, and was followed by 3 others, equally severe, during which all cheer departed from the earth, where the crimes of men increased with fearful rapidity, and where, in the general struggle for life, the last feelings of humanity and compassion disappeared. In the dim recesses of the ironwood, the giantess Jarnsaxa, or Angerboda, diligently fed the wolves, Hati, Skoll, and Managarm. The progeny of Fenris, with the marrow of murderers and adulterers, bones, and such was the prevalence of these vile crimes, that the almost insatiable monsters were never stinted in food, and daily gained more strength to pursue Sol and Mani, whom they finally overtook and devoured, deluging the earth with the blood from their dripping jaws. In the east she was seated, that aged woman in Jarnrid, and there she nourished the posterity of Fenrir. He will be most formidable of all, he who, under the form of a monster, will swallow up the moon. Völuspá, Pfeiffer's translation. As this terrible calamity occurred, the whole earth trembled and shook. The stars, affrighted, fell from their places, and Loki, Fenris, and Garm, renewing their efforts, rent their chains asunder and rushed forth to take their revenge. At the same moment the dragon Nidhugg gnawed through the roots of the ash Yggdrasil, which quivered to its topmost bough. The red cock Fjalar, perched above Valhalla, loudly crowed an alarm, which was immediately echoed by Gullinkambi, the rooster in Midgard, and by Hel's dark red bird in Niflheim. The gold-combed cock, the gods in Valhalla loudly crow to arms. The blood-red cock as shrilly summons all, on earth and down beneath it. Viking Tales of the North, R.B. Anderson. Heimdall, seeing these ominous portents and hearing the cock's shrill cry, immediately put the yallarhorn to his lips and blew the long-expected blast, which was heard throughout the whole world. At the first sound of this rallying call, Aesir and Einarjar sprang from their golden couches, armed themselves for the coming fray, sallied bravely out of the great hall, and, mounting their impatient steeds, galloped over the quivering rainbow bridge to the spacious field of Vigrid, where, as Vafthrûdnir had predicted so long before, the last battle was to take place. The terrible Midgard snake Jormungandr, aroused by the general commotion, writhed and twisted in the bottom of the sea, wriggled out of the deep, lashed the waters with his tail, and, crawling upon land, hastened to join the fray, in which he was to play a prominent part. In giant wrath the serpent tossed, in ocean depths till free from chain, he rose upon the foaming main. Beneath the lashings of his tail, seas mountain high swelled on the land. Then, darting mad, the waves are crossed. pouring forth bloody froth like hail, spurting with poisoned venom breath, foul deadly mists o'er all the earth. Thro' thundering surge he sought the strand. Valhalla, J.C. Jones. One of the great waves, stirred up by Ironmungandar's struggles, set afloat the fatal ship Naglfar, constructed entirely out of the nails of the dead, many relatives having failed in the course of time to do their duty and show the respect due to the deceased, whose nails should have been pared ere they were laid at rest. As soon as this vessel was afloat, Loki boarded it with the fiery host from Muspelheim, and steered it boldly over the stormy waters to the place of conflict. This was not the only vessel bound for Vigrid, however, for out of a thick fog bank towards the north came another ship, steered by Rym, in which were all the frost giants, armed to the teeth and eager for a conflict with the Aesir, whom they had always hated. Through a crevice Hel, the party-coloured goddess of death, crept out of her underground home, closely followed by the hellhound Garum. All the malefactors of her cheerless realm, and the dragon Nidhugg, which flew over the battlefield bearing corpses upon his wings. Seeing these reinforcements to his party as soon as he landed, Loki welcomed them with joy, and placing himself at their head led them on to the fight. Just then the skies were suddenly rent asunder, and through the fiery breach rode Surtr with his flaming sword, followed by his sons, and as they attempted to storm Asgard by riding over the bridge Bifrost, the glorious arch sank with a crash beneath their horses' tread. Down through the fields of air, with glittering armour fair, in battle order bright, they sped while seething flame from rapid hoof-strokes came. Leading his gleaming band rode Surtr, mid the red ranks of raging fire. Valhalla, J.C. Jones. The gods now knew full well that their end was near, and that through weakness and lack of foresight they were labouring under great disadvantages. For Odin had but one eye, Tyr but one hand, and Frey nothing but a stag's horn wherewith to defend himself, instead of his invincible sword. Nevertheless the Aesir did not show any signs of flinching or despair, but, like true northern warriors, donned the richest attire, and gaily rode to the battlefield, determined to sell their lives as dearly as possible, and harbouring no thought of surrender. While they were mustering their forces, Odin once more rode down to the Udr fountain, where, under the wilting Yggdrasil, the Norns sat, with veiled faces, their torn web lying at their feet, obstinately refusing to utter a single word. Once more the father of the gods whispered a mysterious communication to Mimir. Then he remounted Sleipnir and went to join the waiting host. On Vigrid's broad plain the combatants were now all assembled. On one side the stern, calm faces of the Aesir, Vanas and Ainaria; on the other the flashing host of Surtr, the grim frost giants, the pale army of El, Loki leading Garum, Fenris and Ironmungandar, the two latter belching forth fire and smoke and exhaling clouds of noxious, deathly vapours which filled all heaven and earth with their poisonous breath. The years roll on, the generations pass, the ages grow, and bring us nearer to the final day, when from the south shall march the fiery band, and cross the bridge of heaven with Loki for guide, and Fenris at his heel with broken chain, while from the east the giant Reimar steers his ship, and the great serpent makes to land, and all are marshalled in one flaming square against the gods upon the plains of heaven. Balder dead, Matthew Arnold. At a given signal the opposing hosts close in battle fighting as did our ancestors of old, hand to hand and face to face, rushing impetuously onward. Odin and the Fenris wolf came into contact, while Thor attacks the Midgard snake, and Tyr, the dog Garm, Frey closed in with Sotra, Heimdall with Loki, whom he had defeated once before, and the remainder of the gods and all of the Einarjar selected foes worthy of their courage and performed unheard of deeds of valour. But, in spite of their constant practice and glittering arms, Valhalla's host was doomed to defeat, and Odin, after struggling fiercely with the Fenris wolf, saw it suddenly assume colossal proportions, and open its jaws so wide that they embraced all the space between heaven and earth. Then the monster rushed furiously upon the father of the gods and swallowed him whole. Fenrir shall with impious tooth slay the sire of rolling years. Fitar shall avenge his fall, and, struggling with the shaggy wolf, shall cleave his cold and gory jaws. Vafthrudni's Mal. W. Taylor's translation. None of the gods could lend Allfather a helping hand at that critical moment, for Frey succumbed beneath Sotra's flashing sword, Heimdall and Loki fell mutually slain. Tyr and Garm dealt and received from each other a mortal wound, and Thor, after an indescribable encounter with the Midgard snake, slew him by a blow from Mjolnir, staggered back 9 paces, fell, and was drowned in the flood of venom which poured from the dying monster's jaws. Odin's son goes with the monster to fight. Midgard's view in his rage will slay the worm. 9 feet will go, Fjorgin's son, bowed by the serpent who feared no foe. Simon's Edda, Thorpe's translation. Vidar, seeing that his beloved father had succumbed, now came rushing from the other end of the plain to avenge his death, and planting his large shoe upon Fenris's lower jaw, he seized the monster's upper jaw and with one terrible wrench tore him asunder. The other gods who took part in the fray, and all the Einarjar, having now perished, Sotra suddenly flung his fiery brands all over heaven, earth, and the 9 kingdoms of hell. The raging flames rose higher and higher, curled around the stalwart stem of the world ash Yggdrasil, consumed the golden palaces of the gods, destroyed the vegetation upon earth, and made all the waters seethe and boil. Fire's breath assails the all-nourishing tree, towering fire plays against heaven itself. Simon's Edda, Thorpe's translation. This fire raged most fiercely until everything was consumed, when the earth, blackened and scarred, slowly sank down beneath the boiling waves of the sea. Ragnarok had indeed come, the world tragedy was over, the divine actors were slain, and chaos seemed to have returned to resume all its former sway. But as in a play, after the actors are all slain and the curtain has fallen, the audience still expects the principal favourites to appear and make a bow. So the ancient northern races fancied that, all evil having perished in Sotra's flames, goodness would rise from the general ruin, to resume its sway over the earth, and some of the gods would return to dwell in heaven forever. All evil dies there an endless death, while goodness riseth from the great world fire, purified at last, to a life far higher, better, nobler than the past. Viking Tales of the North, R.B. Anderson. As our ancestors believed fully in regeneration, they declared that after a certain space of time the earth, purged by fire and purified by its immersion in the sea, would rise again in all its pristine beauty, and be illumined by the sun, whose chariot was driven by a daughter of Sol's, born before the wolf had devoured her mother. The new orb of day was not imperfect, as the first sun had been, for its rays were no longer so ardent that a shield had to be placed between it and the earth, which soon grew green beneath its beneficent rays, and brought forth flowers and fruit in abundance. 2 human beings, a woman, Lif, and a man, Lifthrasir, now emerged from the depths of Mimir's forest. They had taken refuge there when Sotra set fire to the world, and had sunk into peaceful slumbers, unmindful of the destruction around them, and remained feeding upon the morning dew, until it was safe for them to wander out once more and take possession of the regenerated earth, which their descendants were to people and over which they were to have full sway. We shall see emerge from the bright ocean at our feet an earth, more fresh, more verdant than the last, with fruits self-springing and a seed of man preserved. Who then shall live in peace, as now in war? Dead, Matthew Arnold. All the gods who represented the developing forces of nature were slain on the fatal field of Vigrid, but the imperishable forces of nature, typified by Vali and Vidar, returned to the field of Ida, where they were met by Modi and Magni, Thor's sons, the personifications of strength and energy, who saved their father's sacred hammer from the general destruction and carried it thither with them. Vidar's then and Vali's force hares the empty realm of gods. Mothi's thew and Magni's might sways the massy mallet's weight. Won from Thor when Thor must fall, Vafthrudni's maul. W. Taylor's translation. Here they were joined by Honir, no longer an exile among the Vanas, who, as developing forces, had also vanished forever, and out of the dark underworld where he had languished so long rose the radiant Balder, accompanied by his brother Hodor, with whom he was reconciled, and who was now ready to live with him in perfect amity and peace. Gently and pensively these gods talked of the past, recalled the memory of their former companions, and searching in the long grass of Idavold, found again the golden discs with which the Aesir had been wont to play. We shall tread once more the well-known plain of Ida, and among the grass shall find the golden dice with which we played of yore, and that will bring to mind the former life and pastime of the gods, the wise discourse of Odin, the delights of other days. Dead, Matthew Arnold. Then looking towards the place where their lordly dwellings once stood, the assembled gods became aware of the fact that Gimli, the highest heavenly abode, had not been consumed, but rose glittering before them, its golden roof outshining the sun. And when they hastened thither they discovered with unmixed joy that it had become the place of refuge of all the virtuous. In Gimli the lofty, there shall the host of the virtuous dwell, and through all ages taste of deep gladness. Literature and romance of Northern Europe, Howitt. As the Norsemen who settled in Iceland, and through whom the most complete exposition of the Odinic faith has come down to us in the Eddas and Sagas, were not definitely converted until the 11th century, although they had come into contact with Christians during their Viking raids nearly 6 centuries before. It is very probable that the northern skalds gleaned some idea of the Christian doctrines, and that this knowledge influenced them to a certain extent, and coloured their descriptions of the end of the world and the regeneration of the earth. It was perhaps this vague knowledge also which induced them to add to the Edda a verse, which is generally supposed to have been an interpolation, proclaiming that another god, too mighty to name, would rule over Gimli, judge all mankind, separate the bad from the good, banish the former to the horrors of Nastrond, and invite the latter to taste of endless bliss in the halls of Gimli the Fair. Then comes another, yet more mighty, but him dare I not venture to name. Few farther may look than to where Odin to meet the wolf goes. Literature and romance of Northern Europe, Howitt. There were two other heavenly mansions, however, one reserved for the dwarfs and the other for the giants. For as these creatures had no free will and blindly executed the decrees of fate, they were not held responsible for any harm they had done, and were not punished. The dwarfs, ruled by Sindri, were said to occupy a hall in the Nida Mountains, where they drank the sparkling mead, while the giants took their pleasure in the hall Brima, situated in the region of Okelnor, not cool, for the power of cold was entirely annihilated, and there was no more ice. Various mythologies have, of course, attempted to explain these myths, and some, as we have already stated, see in the history of Ragnarok the influence of Christian teachings, and esteem it only a barbaric version of the end of the world and the coming judgment day, when a new heaven and earth shall arise, and all the good shall enjoy eternal bliss. End of section 28.
Section 29 of Myths of Northern Lands. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Myths of Northern Lands by H.A. Guerber. Greek and Northern Mythologies, a comparison. During the past 50 years, the learned men of many nations have investigated philology and comparative mythology so thoroughly that they have ascertained beyond the possibility of doubt that English, together with all the Teutonic dialects of the continent, belongs to that large family of speech which comprises, besides the Teutonic, Latin, Greek, Slavonic, and Celtic, the Oriental languages of India and Persia. It has also been proved that the various tribes who started from the central home to discover Europe in the north and India in the south carried away with them not only a common language, but a common faith and a common mythology. These are facts which may be ignored but cannot be disputed, and the two sciences of comparative grammar and comparative mythology, though but of recent origin, rest on a foundation as sound and safe as that of any of the inductive sciences. For more than 1,000 years, the Scandinavian inhabitants of Norway have been separated in language from their Teutonic brethren on the continent, and yet both have not only preserved the same stock of popular stories, but they tell them in several instances in almost the same words. This resemblance, so strong in the early literature of nations inhabiting countries which present much the same physical aspect and have nearly the same climate, is not so marked when we compare the northern myths with those of the genial south. Still, notwithstanding the contrast between the boreal and south temperate zones, where these myths gradually ripened and attained their full growth, there is sufficient analogy between the two mythologies to show that the seeds from whence both sprang were originally the same. In the foregoing chapters, the northern system of mythology has been outlined as clearly as possible, and the physical significance of the myths has been explained. Now we shall endeavour to set forth the resemblance of northern mythology to that of the other Aryan nations by comparing it with the Greek, which, however, it does not resemble as closely as it does the Oriental. It is, of course, impossible in a brief work of this character to do more than mention the main points of resemblance in the stories forming the basis of these religions, but that will serve to demonstrate, even to the most sceptical, that they must have been identical at a period too remote to indicate now with any certainty. The northern nations, like the Greeks, imagined that the world rose out of chaos, and while the latter described it as a vapory, formless mass, the former, influenced by their immediate surroundings, depicted it as a chaos of fire and ice, a combination which is only too comprehensible to anyone who has visited Iceland and seen the wild, peculiar contrast between its volcanic soil, spouting geysers, and the great icebergs which hedge it all around during the long, dark winter season. From these opposing elements, fire and ice, were born the first divinities, who, like the first gods of the Greeks, were gigantic in stature and uncouth in appearance. Ymir, the huge ice giant, and his descendants are comparable to the Titans, who were also elemental forces of nature, personifications of subterranean fire, and both, having held full sway for a time, were obliged to yield to greater perfection. After a fierce struggle for supremacy, they all found themselves defeated and banished to the respective remote regions of Tartarus and Jotunheim. The triad, Odin, Vili, and Ve, of the northern myth is the exact counterpart of Jupiter, Neptune, and Pluto, who, superior to the Titan forces, rule supreme over the world in their turn. In the Greek mythology, the gods, who are also all related to one another, betake themselves to Olympus, where they build golden palaces for their use, and in the northern mythology, the divine conquerors repair to Asgard, and there construct similar dwellings. Northern cosmogony was not unlike the Greek, for the people imagined that the earth, Mannerheim, was entirely surrounded by the sea, at the bottom of which lay the huge Midgard snake, biting its own tail, and it was perfectly natural that, viewing the storm-lashed waves which beat against their shores, they should declare they were the result of his convulsive writhing. The Greeks, who also fancied the earth was round and compassed by a mighty river called Oceanus, described it as flowing with a steady, equable current, for they generally gazed out upon calm and sunlit seas. Niflheim, the northern region of perpetual cold and mist, had its exact counterpart in the land north of the Hyperboreans, where feathers, snow, continually hovered in the air, and where Hercules drove the Cyrenian stag into a snowdrift ere he could seize and bind it fast. Like the Greeks, the northern races believed that the earth was created first, and that the vaulted heavens were made afterwards to overshadow it entirely. They also imagined that the sun and moon were daily driven across the sky in chariots drawn by fiery steeds. Sol, the sun maiden, therefore corresponded to Helios, Hyperion, Phoebus, or Apollo, while Mani, the moon, owing to a peculiarity of northern grammar, which makes the sun feminine and the moon masculine, was the exact counterpart of Phoebe, Diana, or Cynthia. The northern Skalds, who thought that they descried the prancing forms of white-maned steeds in the flying clouds, and the glitter of spears in the flashing light of the aurora borealis, said that the Valkyries or battle maidens were galloping across the sky, while the Greeks saw in the same natural phenomena the white flocks of Apollo guarded by Phaethusa and Lampetia. As the dew fell from the clouds, the northern poets declared that it dropped from the manes of the Valkyr steeds, while the Greeks, who generally observed that it sparkled longest in the thickets, identified it with Daphne and Procris, whose names are derived from the Sanskrit word to sprinkle, and who were slain by their lovers, Apollo and Cephalus, personifications of the sun. The earth was considered in the north as well as in the south as a female divinity, the fostering mother of all things, and it was owing to climatic difference only that the mythology of the north, where people were daily obliged to conquer the right to live by a hand-to-hand struggle with nature, should represent her as hard and frozen like Rinda, while the Greeks embodied her in the genial goddess Ceres. The Greeks also believed that the cold winter winds swept down from the north, and the northern races added that they were produced by the winnowing of the wings of the great eagle, Frisvelda. The dwarfs, or dark elves, bred in Yma's flesh, were like Pluto's servants in that they never left their underground realm, where they too sought the precious metals, which they moulded into delicate ornaments, such as Vulcan bestowed upon the gods, and into weapons which no one could either dint or mar. As for the light elves, who lived above ground and cared for plants, trees, and streams, they were evidently the northern substitutes for the nymphs, dryads, oreades, and hamadryads, which peopled the woods, valleys, and fountains of ancient Greece. Jupiter, like Odin, was the father of the gods, the god of victory, and a personification of the universe. Hlidskjalf, All-Father's lofty throne, was no less exalted than Olympus or Ida, whence the Thunderer could observe all that was taking place, and Odin's invincible spear Gungnir was as terror-inspiring as the thunderbolts brandished by his Greek prototype. The northern deities feasted continually upon mead and boar's flesh, the drink and meat most suitable to the inhabitants of a northern climate, while the gods of Olympus preferred the nectar and ambrosia, which were their only sustenance. 12 Aesir sat in Odin's council hall to deliberate over the wisest measures for the government of the world and men, and an equal number of gods assembled on the cloudy peak of Mount Olympus for a similar purpose. The Golden Age in Greece was a period of idyllic happiness amid ever-flowering groves and under balmy skies, while the Northern Age of bliss was also a time when peace and innocence flourished on earth, and when evil was as yet entirely unknown. Using the materials near at hand, the Greeks modelled their first images out of clay. Hence, they naturally imagined that Prometheus had made man out of that substance when called upon to fashion a creature inferior to the gods only. As the northern statues were all hewed out of wood, the northern races inferred, as a matter of course, that Odin, Vili, and Ve, who here correspond to Prometheus, Epimetheus, and Minerva, the 3 Greek creators of man, made the first human couple, Ask and Embla, out of blocks of wood. The goat Hydron, which supplied the heavenly mead, is like Amalthea, Jupiter's first nurse, and the busy telltale Ratatosk is equivalent to the snow-white crow in the story of Coronis, which was turned black in punishment for its tattling. Jupiter's eagle has its counterpart in the ravens Hugin and Munin, or in the wolves Jerry and Friki, which are ever crouching at Odin's feet. The close resemblance between the northern Orlog and the Greek destiny, goddesses whose decrees the gods themselves were obliged to respect, and the equally powerful Norns and Moray is too obvious to need pointing out, while the Vannas are counterparts of Neptune and the other ocean divinities. The great quarrel between the Vannas and the Aesir is merely another version of the dispute between Jupiter and Neptune for the supremacy of the world. Just as Jupiter forces his brother to yield to his authority, so the Aesir remain masters of all, but do not refuse to continue to share their power with their conquered foes, who thus become their allies and friends. Like Jupiter, Odin is always described as majestic and middle-aged, and both gods are regarded as the divine progenitors of royal races. For while the Heraclidae claimed Jupiter as their father, the Inglings, Skjoldings, etc. said Odin was the founder of their families. The most solemn oaths were sworn by Odin's spear as well as by Jupiter's footstool, and both gods rejoice in a multitude of names, all descriptive of the various phases of their nature and worship. Odin, like Jupiter, frequently visited the earth in disguise to judge of the hospitable intentions of mankind, as in the story of Geirrod and Agna, which resembles that of Philemon and Baucis. The aim was to encourage hospitality, Therefore, in both stories, those who showed themselves humanely inclined are richly rewarded, and in the northern myth the lesson is enforced by the punishment inflicted upon Geirrod, as the Skalds believed in poetic justice and saw that it was carefully meted out. The contest of wit between Odin and Vafthrudnir has its parallel in the musical rivalry of Apollo and Marsyas, or in the test of skill between Minerva and Arachne. Odin further resembled Apollo in that he too was god of eloquence and poetry, and could win all hearts to him by means of his divine voice. He was like Mercury in that he taught mortals the use of runes, while the Greek god introduced the alphabet. The disappearance of Odin, the sun or summer, and the consequent desolation of Frigga, the earth, is merely a different version of the myths of Proserpine and Adonis. When Proserpine and Adonis have gone, the earth, Ceres or Venus, bitterly mourns their absence and refuses all consolation. It is only when they return from their exile that she casts off her mourning garments and gloom, and again decks herself in all her jewels. So Frigga and Freya bewail the absence of their husbands, Odin and Odur, and remain hard and cold until their return. Odin's wife Saga, the goddess of history, who lingered by Sokvabek, the stream of time and events, taking note of all she saw, is like Clio, the muse of history, whom Apollo sought by the inspiring fount of Helicon. Just as, according to Euhemerus, there was an historical Zeus buried in Crete, where his grave can still be seen, so there was an historical Odin, whose mound rises near Uppsala, where the greatest northern temple once stood, and where there was a mighty oak which rivaled the famous tree of Dodona. Frigga, like Juno, was a personification of the atmosphere, the patroness of marriage, of connubial and motherly love, and the goddess of childbirth. She too is represented as a beautiful, stately woman, rejoicing in her adornments, and her special attendant, Gna, rivals Iris in the rapidity with which she executes her mistress's behests. Juno has full control over the clouds, which she can brush away with the motion of her hand, and Frigga is supposed to weave them out of the thread she has spun on her jeweled spinning wheel. In Greek mythology, we find many examples of the way in which Juno seeks to outwit Jupiter. Similar tales are not lacking in the northern myths. Juno obtains possession of Io in spite of her husband's reluctance to part with her, and Frigga artfully secures the victory for the winnerless in the Langobardian saga. Odin's wrath at Frigga's theft of the gold from his statue is equivalent to Jupiter's marital displeasure at Juno's jealousy and interference during the War of Troy. In the story of Gefjon and the clever way in which she procured land from Gylfi to form her kingdom of Sealand, we have a reproduction of the story of Dido, who obtained by stratagem the land upon which she founded her city of Carthage. In both accounts, oxen come into play, for while in the northern myth these sturdy beasts draw the piece of land far out to sea, in the other, an ox hide cut into strips serves to enclose the queen's grant. The Pied Piper of Hamelin, who could attract all living creatures by his music, is like Orpheus or Amphion, whose lyres have the same power, and Odin, as leader of the dead, is the counterpart of Mercury, Psychopompus, both being personifications of the wind, on whose wings disembodied souls were thought to be wafted away from this mortal sphere. The trusty Eckhart, who would fain save Tannhäuser and prevent his returning to expose himself to the enchantments of the sorceress in the Horselberg, is like the Greek Mentor, who not only accompanied Telemachus, but who gave him good advice and wise instructions, and would like to have rescued Ulysses from the hands of Calypso. Thor, the northern thunder god, also has many points of resemblance with Jupiter. He bears the hammer Mjolnir, the northern emblem of the deadly thunderbolt, and, like Jupiter, uses it freely when warring against the giants. In his rapid growth, Thor resembles Mercury, for while the former playfully tosses several loads of ox hides about a few hours after his birth, the latter steals Apollo's oxen before he is 1 day old. In physical strength, Thor resembles Hercules, who also gave early proofs of uncommon vigour by strangling the serpents sent to slay him in his cradle, and who delighted later on in attacking and conquering giants and monsters. Hercules became a woman and took to spinning to please Omphale, the Lydian queen, and Thor assumed a woman's apparel to visit Thrym and recover his hammer, which had been buried 9 rasts underground. The hammer, his principal attribute, was used for many sacred purposes. It consecrated the funeral pyre and the marriage rite, and boundary stakes driven in by a hammer were considered as sacred among northern nations as the Hermi, or statues of Mercury, whose removal was punished by death. Thor's wife, Sif, with her luxuriant golden hair, is, as we have already stated, an emblem of the earth, and her hair of its rich vegetation. Loki's theft of these tresses is equivalent to Pluto's rape of Proserpine. To recover the golden locks, Loki must visit the Dwarfs, Pluto's servants, crouching in the low passages of the underground world, so Mercury must seek Proserpine in Hades. The gadfly, which hinders Jupiter from recovering possession of Io after Mercury has slain Argus, reappears in the northern myth to sting Brock and prevent the manufacture of the magic ring Draupnir, which is merely a counterpart of Sif's tresses, as it also represents the fruits of the earth. It continues to torment the dwarf during the manufacture of Frey's golden-bristled boar, a prototype of Apollo's golden sun chariot, and it prevents the perfect formation of the handle of Thor's hammer. The magic ship Skidbladnir, also made by the dwarfs, is like the swift-sailing Argo, which was a personification of the clouds sailing overhead. And just as the former was said to be large enough to accommodate all the gods, so the latter bore all the Greek heroes off to the distant land of Colchis. The Germans, wishing to name the days of the week after their gods, as the Romans had done, gave the name of Thor to Jove's day, and thus made it the present Thursday. Thor's struggle against Hrungnir is like the fight between Hercules and Cacus or Antaeus, while Groa is evidently Ceres, for she too mourns for her absent child or Vandal, Proserpine, and breaks out into a song of joy when she hears it will return. Magni, Thor's son, who, when only 3 hours old, exhibits his marvellous strength by lifting Hrungnir's leg off his recumbent father, also reminds us of the infant Hercules. And Thor's voracious appetite at Thrym's wedding feast has its parallel in Mercury's first meal, which consisted of 2 whole oxen. Thor's crossing the swollen tide of Vima reminds us of Jason's wading across the torrent when on his way to visit the tyrant Peleus and recover possession of his father's throne. The marvellous necklace worn by Frigga and Freya to enhance their charms is like the cestus or girdle of Venus, which Juno borrowed to subjugate her lord, and is, like Sif's tresses and the ring Draupnir, an emblem of luxuriant vegetation or a type of the stars which jewel the firmament. The northern sword god Tyr is, of course, the Roman war god Mars, whom he so closely resembles that his name was given to the day of the week held sacred to Mars, which is even now known as Tuesday or Tuesday. Like Mars, Tyr was noisy and courageous. He delighted in the din of battle and warfare and was quite fearless at all times. He alone dared to brave the Fenris wolf, and the southern proverb concerning Scylla and Charybdis has its counterpart in the northern adage, to get loose out of Ladding and to dash out of Droma. The Fenris wolf, also a personification of subterranean fire, is bound, like his prototypes, the Titans, in Tartarus. The similarity between the gentle music-loving Brage with his harp in hand and Apollo or Orpheus is very great. So is the resemblance between the magic draught Odreria and the waters of Helicon, which were also supposed to serve as inspiration to mortal as well as to immortal poets. Odin dons eagle plumes to bear away this precious mead, and Jupiter assumes a similar guise to secure his cupbearer Ganymede. Eden, like Adonis and Proserpine, or still more like Eurydice, is also a fair personification of spring. She is borne away by the cruel ice giant Thiasse, who represents the boar which slew Adonis, the kidnapper of Proserpine, or the poisonous serpent which bit Eurydice. Eden is detained for a long, long time in Jotunheim, Hades, where she forgets all her merry, playful ways and becomes mournful and pale. She cannot return alone to Asgard, and it is only when Loki, now an emblem of the south wind, comes to bear her away in the shape of a nut or a swallow that she can effect her escape. She reminds us of Proserpine and Adonis escorted back to earth by Mercury, god of the wind, or of Eurydice lured out of Hades by the sweet sounds of Orpheus's harp, which were also symbolical of the soughing of the winds. The myth of Eden's fall from Yggdrasil into the darkest depths of Niflheim, while subject to the same explanation and comparison as the above story, is still more closely related to the tale of Orpheus and Eurydice, for the former, like Brage, cannot exist without the latter, whom he follows even into the dark realm of death. Without her, his songs are entirely silenced. The wolfskin in which Eden is enveloped is typical of the heavy snows in northern regions, which are considered a great blessing as they preserve the tender roots from the blighting influence of the extreme winter cold. The Van Njord, who is god of the sunny summer seas, has his counterpart in Neptune, and more especially in Nereus, the personification of the calm and pleasant aspect of the mighty deep. Njord's wife, Skadi, is the northern huntress. She therefore resembles Diana. Like her, she bears a quiver full of arrows and a bow which she handles with consummate skill. Her short gown permits the utmost freedom of motion also, and she too is generally accompanied by a hunting hound. The myths of the transference of Thiasse's eyes to the firmament, where they glow like brilliant stars, reminds us of many Greek star myths, and especially of Argus's eyes ever on the watch, of Orion and his jeweled girdle, and of his dog Sirius, all changed into stars by the gods to appease angry goddesses. Loki's antics to win a smile from the irate Skadi are considered akin to the quivering flashes of sheet lightning which he personified in the north, while Steripes, the Cyclops, typified it for the Greeks. The northern god of sunshine and summer showers, the genial Frey, has many traits in common with Apollo, for, like him, he is beautiful and young, rides the golden-bristled boar, which was the northern conception of the sunbeams, or drives across the sky in a golden car, which reminds us of Apollo's glittering chariot. Frey has some of the gentle Zephyrus's characteristics besides, for he too scatters flowers along his way. His horse, Bludogophi, is not unlike Pegasus, Apollo's favourite steed, for it can pass through fire and water with equal ease and velocity. Fro, like Odin and Jupiter, is also identified with a human king, and his mound lies beside Odin's near Uppsala. His reign was so happy that it was called the Golden Age, and he therefore reminds us of Saturn, who, exiled to earth, ruled over the people of Italy and granted them similar prosperity. Gerda, the beautiful maiden, is like Venus, and also like Atalanta. She is hard to woo and hard to win, like the fleet-footed maiden, but, like her, she yields at last and becomes a happy wife. The golden apples with which Skirner tries to bribe her remind us of the golden fruit which Hippomenes cast in Atalanta's way, and which made her lose the race. Freya, the goddess of youth, love, and beauty, like Venus, sprang from the sea, for she is a daughter of the sea god Njord. Venus shows that she is not entirely devoid of martial tastes by bestowing her best affections upon Mars and Anchises, while Freya often assumes the garb of a Valkyr and rides rapidly down to earth to take her part in mortal strife and bear away one half of the heroes slain to feast in her halls. Like Venus, she delights in offerings of fruit and flowers, lends a gracious ear to the petitions of lovers, and favours them as much as she can. Freya also resembles Minerva, for like her, she wears a helmet and breastplate, and like her also, she is noted for her beautiful blue eyes. Odur, Freya's husband, is like Adonis, and when he leaves her, she too sheds countless tears, which in her case are turned to gold, while Venus's tears are changed into anemones, and those of the Heliades, mourning for Phaeton, hardened to amber, which resembles gold in colour and in consistency. Just as Venus rejoices at Adonis's return, and all nature blooms in sympathy with her joy, so Freya becomes light-hearted once more when she has found her husband-lover beneath the flowering myrtles of the south. Venus's car is drawn by fluttering doves, while Freya's is swiftly carried along by cats, which are emblems of sensual love, just as the doves were considered types of tenderest love. Freya is so sensitive to beauty that she angrily refuses to marry Thrym, and Venus scorns and finally deserts Vulcan, whom she has been forced to marry much against her will. The Greeks represented Justice as a blindfolded goddess with scales in one hand and a sword in the other, to indicate the impartiality and the fixity of her decrees. The corresponding deity of the north was Forseti, who patiently listened to both sides of a question ere he too promulgated his impartial and irrevocable sentence. Ulla, the winter god, resembles Apollo and Orion only in his love for the chase, which he pursues with ardour under all circumstances. He is the northern bowman, and his skill is quite as unerring as theirs. Heimdall, like Argus, was gifted with marvellous keenness of sight, which enabled him to perceive even the growth of the grass. His Jarla horn, which could be heard throughout all the world, proclaiming the gods' passage to and fro over the quivering bridge Bifrost, was like the trumpet of the goddess Renown. As he was related to the water deities on his mother's side, he could, like Proteus, assume any form at will, and made good use of this power on one occasion to frustrate Loki's attempt to steal the necklace Brisingamen. Hermod, the quick or nimble, resembles Mercury not only in his marvellous celerity of motion, but he too was the messenger of the gods, and, like the Greek divinity, he flashed hither and thither, aided not by winged cap and sandals, but by Odin's steed Sleipnir, whom he alone was allowed to bestride. Instead of the caduceus, he bore the wand Gambantian. He questioned the Norns and the magician Rosthiof, through whom he learned that Vali would come to avenge his brother Balder and to supplant his father Odin. Instances of similar consultations are found in Greek mythology, where Jupiter would fain have married Thetis, yet desisted when the fates foretold that she would be the mother of a son destined to surpass his father in glory and renown. The northern god of silence, Vidar, has some resemblance to Hercules, for while the latter has nothing but a club with which to defend himself against the Nemean lion, whom he tears asunder, the former, protected by one large shoe, rends the Fenris wolf at Ragnarok. Odin's courtship of Rinda reminds us of Jupiter's wooing of Danae, who was also a symbol of the earth, and while the shower of gold in the Greek tale is intended to represent the fertilizing sunbeams, the footbath in the northern story typifies the spring thaw, which sets in when the sun has overcome the resistance of the frozen earth. Perseus, the child of this union, has many points of resemblance with Vali, for he too is an avenger and slays his mother's enemies just as surely as Vali destroys Hoder, the murderer of Balder. The Fates were supposed to preside over birth in Greece and to foretell a child's future just as well as the Norns. And the story of Meleager has its unmistakable parallel in that of Norna Gesta. Althea preserves the half-consumed brand in a chest. Norna Gesta conceals the candle end in his harp. And while the Greek mother brings about her son's death by casting the brand into the fire, Norna Gesta, compelled to light his candle end at Olaf's command, dies as it sputters and goes out. Hebe and the Valkyrs were the cupbearers of Olympus and Asgard. They were all personifications of youth. And while Hebe married the great hero and demigod Hercules when she retired from office, the Valkyrs were relieved from further attendance when united to heroes like Helgi, Hakon, Volund, or Sigurd. The Cretan labyrinth has its counterpart in the Icelandic Volunda house, and Volund and Daedalus both effect their escape from a maze by a cleverly devised pair of wings, which enables them to fly in safety over land and sea and escape from the tyranny of their respective masters, Nidud and Minos. Volund resembles Vulcan also in that he is a clever smith and makes use of his talents to work out his revenge. Vulcan, lamed by a fall from Olympus and neglected by Juno, whom he had tried to befriend, sends her a golden throne, which is provided with cunning springs to seize and hold her fast. Volund, hamstringed by the suggestion of Nidud's queen, secretly murders her sons and out of their eyes fashions marvelous jewels, which he unsuspectingly wears upon her breast until he reveals their origin. Just as the Greeks fancied that the tempests were the effect of Neptune's wrath, so the northern races attributed them either to the writhings of Jormungand, the Midgard snake, or to the anger of Aegir, who, crowned with seaweed like Neptune, often sent his children, the wave maidens, the counterpart of the Nereides and Oceanids, out to play in the tossing billows. Neptune had his dwelling in the coral caves near the island of Euboea, while Aegir lived in a similar palace near Kattegat. Here he was surrounded by the Nixies, Undines, and mermaids, the counterpart of the Greek water nymphs, and by the river gods of the Rhine, Elba and Neckar, who remind us of Alpheus and Peneus, the river gods of the Greeks. The frequency of shipwrecks on the northern coasts made the people describe Ran, the equivalent of the Greek sea goddess Amphitrite, as greedy and avaricious, and armed with a strong net, with which he drew all things down into the deep. The Greek sirens had their parallel in the northern Lorelei, who possessed the same gift of song, and also lured mariners to their death, while Princess Ilse, who was turned into a fountain, reminds us of the nymph Arethusa, who underwent a similar transformation. In the northern conception of Niflheim, we have an almost exact counterpart of the Greek Hades. Modgud, the guardian of the Gialabru, the bridge of death, over which all the spirits of the dead must pass, exacts a tribute of blood as rigorously as Charon demands an obelisk from every soul he ferries over Acheron, the river of death. The fierce dog Garm, cowering in the Dnieper hole and keeping guard at Hell's gate, is like the three-headed monster Cerberus, and the 9 worlds of Niflheim are not unlike the divisions of Hades, Nastrond being an adequate substitute for Tartarus, where the wicked were punished with equal severity. The custom of burning dead heroes with their arms and of slaying victims, such as horses and dogs, upon their pyre, was much the same in the north as in the south. And while Mors or Thanatos, the Greek death, was represented with a sharp scythe, Hell was depicted with a broom or rake, which she used as ruthlessly and with which she did as much execution. Balder, the radiant god of sunshine, reminds us not only of Apollo and Orpheus, but of all the other heroes of sun myths. His wife Nanna is like Flora, and still more like Proserpine, for she too goes down into the underworld, where she tarries for a while. Balder's golden hall of Breidablik is like Apollo's palace in the east. He too delights in flowers. All things smile at his approach, and willingly take an oath of allegiance to him. Just as Achilles is vulnerable only in the heel, Balder can be slain only by the harmless mistletoe, and his death is occasioned by Loki's jealousy, just as truly as Hercules was slain by Deianira's. Balder's funeral pyre on Ringhorn reminds us of Hercules' death on Mount Oeta, the flames and reddish glow of both fires serving to typify the setting sun. The northern god of sun and summer could only be released from Nibelheim if all animate and inanimate objects shed tears, so Proserpine could issue from Hades only upon condition that she had partaken of no food. The trifling refusal of Thok to shed a single tear is like the pomegranate seeds which Proserpine ate, and the result is equally disastrous in both cases, as it detains Balder and Proserpine underground, and the earth, Frigga or Ceres must continue to mourn their absence. Through Loki, evil entered into the northern world. Prometheus's gift of fire brought the same curse down upon the Greeks. The punishment inflicted by the gods upon both culprits is not unlike, for while Loki is bound with adamantine chains underground, and tortured by the continuous dropping of venom from the fangs of a snake fastened above his head, Prometheus is bound to Caucasus by adamantine fetters also, and a ravenous vulture continually preys upon his liver. Loki's punishment has another counterpart in that of Tityus, bound in Hades, and in that of Enceladus, chained beneath Mount Etna, where his writhing produced earthquakes, and his imprecations were the sudden eruptions of the volcano. Loki further resembles Neptune in that he too assumed an equine form and was the parent of a wonderful steed, for Sleipnir rivals Arion both in speed and endurance. The Fimbulwinter has been compared to the long preliminary fight under the walls of Troy, and Ragnarok, the grand closing drama of northern mythology, to the burning of that famous city. Thor is Hector, the Fenris wolf, Pyrrhus, son of Achilles, who slew Priam, Odin, and Vidar, who survives in Ragnarok, is Aeneas. The destruction of Priam's palace is the type of the ruin of the gods' golden halls, and the devouring wolves Hati, Skoll, and Managam, the fiends of darkness, are prototypes of Paris and all the other demons of darkness who bear away or devour the sun maiden Helen. According to another interpretation, however, Ragnarok and the consequent submersion of the world is only a northern version of the deluge. The survivors, Lif and Lifthrasir, are like Deucalion and Pyrrha, who were destined to repeople the world, and just as the shrine of Delphi alone resisted the destructive power of the great cataclysm, so Gimli stood radiant to receive the surviving gods. We have already seen how closely the northern giants resembled the Titans. Now it only remains to mention that while the Greeks imagined that Atlas was changed into a mountain, so the giants in Germany formed the Riesenberger, and that the avalanches were the burdens of snow, which they impatiently shook off in changing their cramped positions. The apparition of one of the water giants, in the shape of a bull, in order to court the queen of the Franks, has its parallel in the story of Jupiter's wooing of Europa, and Meroveus is evidently the exact counterpart of Sarpedon. A faint resemblance can be traced between the giant ship Manningfoyle and the Argo, for while the one is supposed to have cruised all around the Aegean and Euxine seas, and to have made many places memorable by the dangers it encountered there, so the northern vessel sailed about the North and Baltic seas, and is mentioned in connection with the island of Bornholm and the cliffs of Dover. while the Greeks imagined that the nightmares were the evil dreams which escaped from the cave of Somnus, the northern race fancied they were female dwarfs or trolls who crept out of the dark recesses of the earth to torment them. All magic weapons in the north were the work of the dwarfs, the underground smiths, while those of the Greeks were manufactured by Vulcan and the Cyclops under Mount Etna or on the island of Lemnos. In the Sigurd myth, we find Odin one-eyed like the Cyclops, who are also personifications of the sun. Sigurd is instructed by Guerber, the horse trainer, who, like Chiron, the centaur, is not only able to teach a young hero all he need know and to give him good advice concerning his future conduct, but is also possessor of the gift of prophecy. The marvellous sword, which becomes the property of Sigmund and of Sigurd as soon as they prove themselves worthy to wield it, reminds us of the weapon which Aegeus concealed beneath the rock, and which Theseus secured as soon as he had become a man. Sigurd, like Theseus, Perseus, and Jason, seeks to avenge his father's wrongs ere he sets out in search of the Golden Hoard, the exact counterpart of the Golden Fleece, which is also guarded by a dragon and is very hard to secure. Like all the Greek sun gods and heroes, Sigurd has golden hair and bright blue eyes. His struggle with Fafnir reminds us of Apollo's fight with Python, while the ring and Varanot can be likened to Venus's cestus, and the curse attached to its possessor is like the doom which accompanied Helen and caused endless bloodshed wherever she went. Sigurd could never have conquered Fafnir without the magic sword, just as the Greeks could never have taken Troy without the arrows of Philoctetes, which are also emblems of the all-conquering rays of the sun. The recovery of the stolen treasure is like Menelaus's recovery of Helen, and it apparently brings as little happiness to Sigurd as his recreant wife did to the Spartan king. Brunhild resembles Minerva in martial tastes, in physical appearance, and in knowledge, but when Sigurd deserts her in favour of Gudrun, she becomes angry and resentful, like Oenone, when Paris left her to woo Helen. Brunhild's anger continues to accompany Sigurd through life, and she even seeks to compass his death, while Oenone, feeling she can cure her wounded lover, refuses to do so and permits him to die. Oenone and Brunhild are both overcome by the same remorseful feelings when their lovers have breathed their last, and both insist upon sharing their funeral pyres and end their lives lying by the side of those whom they had loved. Containing, as it does, a whole series of sun myths, the Volsunga Saga repeats itself in every phase, and just as Ariadne, forsaken by the sun hero Theseus, finally marries Bacchus, so Gudrun, when Sigurd has departed, marries Atli, the king of the Huns. He too ends his life amid the flickering flames of his burning palace or ship. Gunnar, like Orpheus or Amphion, plays such marvellous strains upon his harp that even the serpents are lulled to sleep. According to some interpretations, Atli is like Fafnir and covets the possession of the gold. Both are therefore probably personifications of the winter cloud which broods over and keeps from mortals the goals of the sun's light and heat, till in the spring the bright orb overcomes the powers of darkness and tempests, and scatters his gold over the face of the earth. Swanhild, Sigurd's daughter, is another personification of the sun, as is shown by her blue eyes and golden hair, and her death under the hoofs of black steeds represents the blotting out of the sun by the clouds of storm or of darkness. Just as Castor and Pollux hasten off to rescue their sister Helen when she has been borne away by Theseus, so Swanhild's brothers, Erp, Hamdir, and Sorli, hasten off to avenge her death. Such are the main points of resemblance between the mythologies of the North and South, and the analogy serves to prove that they were originally formed from the same materials, and that the difference consists principally in the local colouring unconsciously given by each nation. End of section 29. Read by Belinda McReynolds, Melbourne, 8th of May, 2024. End of Myths of Northern Lands by H. A. Guerber.